I never asked for this crown. Gold is cold and heavy on the head, but so long as I am the king, I have a duty. If I must sacrifice one child to the flames to save 1,000,000 from the dark, sacrifice is never easy, Davos, or it is no true sacrifice. Tell him, my lady. Azor a high-tempered Lightbringer with the heart's blood of his own beloved wife. If a man with 1,000 cows gives one to God, that is nothing, but a man who offers the only cow he owns. Welcome back to the Company of the Cat. Hi. If you've been around my channel before, you probably know I'm a big fan of Stannis Baratheon. And while he's one of the most popular, and let's be honest, characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, he's also one of the most misinterpreted figures in the story. A big chunk of the fandom is, let's just say, they're a bit delusional when it comes to his character and personality. And honestly, it kinda makes sense, sort of. This is what I'm here to break down. Before we dive in, let me clarify. If you're looking for a deep dive into the Battle of Ice, Stannis' military movements, or an in-depth analysis of past battles and wars, this isn't that kind of video. There will be some ideas and predictions about the Battle of Winterfell, yes, but this is mainly a character analysis on Stannis and what we can expect from him in the bigger picture, particularly regarding the others, the sacrifice of Shireen, and the magical conflict, rather than politics. So grab a cup of tea or coffee, maybe a snack, because this video is long, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy my content. Stannis Baratheon, born in 264 AC to Lord Steffon Baratheon and Lady Cassana Estermond, is the middle of the three Baratheon brothers. He shares the tall, broad-shouldered build of his house, along with its signature black hair and blue eyes. But his entire presence is rigid and severe, his withered face reflecting his no-nonsense nature. Unlike most Baratheons we have seen, both in the present and through historical accounts, Stannis lacks the easy charisma and warmth. From the start, his life has been defined by expectations and disappointments. Overshadowed by Robert's effortless magnetism and Renly's charm, Stannis was always the outlier. Solemn and withdrawn, an introverted child who never seemed to fit the mold of what a Baratheon was supposed to be. Even as a child, he carried a weight far beyond his years, a contrast that only became more pronounced with time. By the time we meet him in A Game of Thrones, Stannis serves as King Robert's Master of Ships in the Small Council, a seasoned commander and sailor who values discipline and efficiency. He is a man ruled by duty, justice, and an unyielding code of honor, but that sense of justice comes with a cold pragmatism and a deep bitterness. Having spent his life demanding respect rather than inspiring affection, Stannis often finds himself isolated. He is described as a military man through and through. An 18-year-old Stannis during Robert's Rebellion held Storm's End through one of the war's longest and most desperate sieges that lasted for a whole year. Robert failed to acknowledge his sacrifices, assigning him Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen after the rebellion, a seat he considered an insult, instead of their ancestral castle Storm's End, after Stannis crushed the remnants of House Targaryen's forces. Later, during the Greyjoy Rebellion, he led the rebuilt royal fleet to the Sunset Sea, where he destroyed much of the Iron Fleet and subdued Great Wick in his brother's name. Yet Robert's constant dismissiveness has festered into a deep resentment that has lingered throughout Stannis' service on the Small Council to the present day. His life, personal and public, is presented as grim and joyless. His marriage to Lady Selyse Florent is devoid of affection. They have only one child, Shireen, who was affected by grayscale during infancy and has remained scarred because of it. Stannis is uneasy around women and uncomfortable with courtesies, making him a very bad diplomat and generally unfit for extended social interactions. And this rigidity extends to every relationship of his. Stannis is almost a backdrop character in A Game of Thrones. Present yet distant. Others discuss with him, and his actions shape events, but he never feels particularly important until the very end of the book. By then we hear that he is building ships, hiring sellswords, and has taken a Shadowbinder from Assign to his service. Tywin Lannister immediately recognizes him as the most serious threat in the coming war, and indeed, if Stannis had been more likable or even slightly more agreeable, he would have serious support from both noble houses and common folk alike. When A Clash of Kings begins, we finally see Stannis as a main player, now drawn to the faith of R'hllor under the influence of Melisandre. She declares him not just a king, but the prophesied savior of the realm, setting him apart from his brothers and the rest of the people involved in the War of the Five Kings. Stannis is a relatively relatable individual, as well as quite a complex character, and that complexity makes him incredibly compelling. But it also makes people view his story through rose-tinted glasses, ignoring the central elements of his narratives that foreshadow his inevitable fall, elements that have been present since the very beginning, as well as his flaws. We do get two very telling stories about how his childhood shaped him and his ideas and beliefs. One of Stannis' earliest memories was of visiting King's Landing as a child with Robert. Melisandre put her hand on the king's arm. The Lord of Light cherishes the innocent. There is no sacrifice more precious. From his king's blood and his untainted fire, a dragon shall be born. Stannis did not pull away from Melisandre's touch, as he had done from his queen's. The Red Woman was all Selyse was not, young, full-bodied and strangely beautiful, with her heart-shaped face, coppery hair and unearthly red eyes. It would be a wondrous thing to see stone come to life, he admitted grudging. And to mount a dragon. I remember the first time my father took me to court. Robert had to hold my hand. I could not have been older than 4, which would have made him 5 or 6. We agreed afterward that the king had been as noble as the dragons were fearsome, Stannis nodded. Years later our father told us that Aerys had cut himself on the throne that morning, so his hand had taken his place. It was Tywin Lannister who so impressed us. His fingers touched the surface of the table, tracing a path lightly across the varnished hills. Robert took the skulls down when he donned the crown, but he could not bear to have them destroyed. Dragon wings over Westeros. There would be such a... Your Grace? Davos edged forward. Might I speak? The second one is the story of Proudwing. When I was a lad, I found an injured goshawk and nursed her back to health. Proudwing, I named her. She would perch on my shoulder and flutter from room to room after me and take food from my hand. But she would not soar. Time and again I would take her hawking, but she never flew higher than the treetops. Robert called her Weakwing. He owned a Griff falcon named Thunderclap who never missed her strike. One day our great-uncle Sir Herbert told me to try a different bird. I was making a fool of myself with Proudwing, he said. And he was right. Stannis Baratheon turned away from the window, and the ghost who moved upon the southern sea. The 7 have never brought me so much as a sparrow. It is time I tried another hawk, Davos. A red hawk. Stannis is actually quite an insecure and bitter guy, and from the stories we get, unlike Robert, who thrived in every environment, Stannis' leadership was never effortless. He tried, but where Robert was bold and beloved, Stannis is stiff and pretty unlikable, according to most people. It's sad because from the stories we get, Stannis was shaped by his environment. Being naturally subdued and compassionate was mocked and criticized, so he left those qualities behind. Present-day Stannis is bullheaded, bitter, and constantly angry, constantly comparing himself to Robert. And he's not even the only one. Years have passed since Robert's death, and people are still pointing out these differences. Differences we know annoy Stannis to no end. Even Stannis' own men recognize how much it pisses him off whenever Robert is mentioned. 15 days, the knights told each other. Robert would have done it in 10. Asa heard Lord Fell boasting. His grandsire had been slain by Robert at Summerhall. Somehow this had elevated his slayer to godlike prowess in the grandson's eyes. Robert would have been inside Winterfell a fortnight ago, thumping his nose at Bolton from the battlements. Best not to mention that to Stannis, suggested Justin Massey, or he'll have us marching nights as well as days. This king lives in his brother's shadow, Asa thought. It's a wound that never truly healed and defines much of his character. It doesn't matter that in many ways Stannis was and is far more effective and capable than Robert, or a better person for that matter, or that Robert was often carried by his allies, because people either don't know that, or simply don't care. What matters is that Robert was likable enough to inspire loyalty, to have allies willing to carry him. Throughout their childhood, whatever Stannis did, Robert had done first and better. It's a reality he never managed to escape from, one that only hardened him further. The story of Proudwing is more of a metaphor than anything. In that moment, Stannis learned not to be soft or compassionate, because in the society he grew up in, those traits were for fools and women, and sadly that's still what he believes. Which becomes painfully obvious when you look at his relationship with Maester Crescent, the one person who truly saw him. "We have found the most splendid fool," he wrote Crescent, a fortnight before he was to return from his fruitless mission. "Only a boy, yet nimble as a monkey and witty as a dozen courtiers. He juggles and riddles and does magic, and he can sing prettily in 4 tongues. We have bought his freedom and hope to bring him home with us. Robert would be delighted with him, and perhaps in time he will even teach Stannis how to laugh." It saddened Crescent to remember that letter. No one had ever taught Stannis how to laugh, least of all the boy Patchface. Stannis and Robert were both present at Storm's End when Stefan and Cassandra were expected to return from their voyage. Looking on from the parapets of the castle, when the ship came in sight, they witnessed how the ship was smashed against the rocks in Shipbreaker's Bay and drowned, with Stefan and Cassandra dying. According to Stannis, he lost his faith in the Seven that day. Crescent has served as the boys' caretaker after their parents' death. Because he could see how much more Stannis struggled with fitting in, he was the one Crescent worried over the most, the one he tried to guide. He knew Stannis would never be charming, easygoing and carefree like Robert or Renly, but he believed in his potential. And this relationship between Stannis and Crescent is, in my opinion, the most defining of his character in the present. From the very first chapter in which Stannis Baratheon truly takes the stage, all his defining flaws are laid down. The Prologue of A Clash of Kings is not just our introduction to Stannis as a major player in the war to come, but also a showcase of the very qualities that will lead to his downfall. Surely half a kingdom is better than none, and if you help the boy avenge his father's murder, why should I avenge Eddard Stark? The man was nothing to me. Oh, Robert loved him, to be sure. Loved him as a brother. How often did I hear that? I was his brother, not Ned Stark, but you would never have known it by the way he treated me. I held Storm's End for him, watching good men starve while Mace Tyrell and Pax the Red Wine feasted within sight on my walls. Did Robert thank me? No. He thanked Stark for lifting the siege when we were down to rats and radishes. I built a fleet at Robert's command. Took Dragonstone in his name. Did he take my hand and say, "Well done, brother? Whatever should I do without you?" No. He blamed me for letting Willem Darry steal away Viserys and the babe. As if I could have stopped it. I sat on his council for 15 years, helping Jon Arryn rule his realm while Robert drank and whored. But when Jon died, did my brother name me his hand? No. He went galloping off to his dear friend Ned Stark and offered him the honor, and small good did either of them. "Be that as it may, my lord," Maester Crescent said gently, "great wrongs have been done to you, but the past is dust. The future may yet be won if you join with the Starks. There are others you might sound out as well. What of Lady Arryn? If the Queen murdered her husband, surely she will want justice for him. She has a young son, Jon Arryn's heir. If you were to betroth Shireen to him..." Even when presented with a clear opportunity to advance his cause, Stannis refuses to even consider it, because he can never let go of the past. The entire prologue of A Clash of Kings makes this painfully clear. Stannis is utterly stuck, unable to move forward because his mind remains fixated on Robert. Even after his brother's death, every decision he makes is still shaped by the resentment he harbored for him in life. He won't negotiate, not because it wouldn't benefit him, but because he refuses to accept anything less than what he believes was always owed to him. His sense of justice and duty, his inability to inspire loyalty beyond obligation, his cold pragmatism, his jealousy, his bitterness, and his refusal to compromise even when it would benefit him in the long run, are all intertwined with each other and present in this prologue. And to be fair, this chapter doesn't receive the recognition it deserves as a literary piece, if I do say so myself. It's a masterclass in characterization, made even more compelling by the fact that unlike other prologues, it involves characters who remain central to the story, characters we continue to see and interact with. And more importantly, it gives us a deeper understanding of an important character who lacks a POV, making his portrayal all the more significant. Stannis is a dick. There is a reason most in-universe people do not like him. You are too ill and too confused to be of use to me, old man. It sounded so like Lord Stannis' voice, but it could not be. It could not. Pylos will counsel me henceforth. Already he works with the Raven, since you can no longer climb to the rookery. I will not have you kill yourself in my service. Maester Crescent blinked. Stannis, my sad sullen boy, son I never had, you must not do this. Don't you know how I have cared for you, lived for you, loved you? Despite all. Yes, loved you, better than Robert even, or Renly. For you were the one unloved, the one who needed me most. Yet all he said was as you command, my lord. But I am hungry. Might not I have a place at your table? At your side. I belong at your side. Sir Davos rose from the bench. I should be honoured if the Maester should sit here beside me, your grace. His treatment of Crescent here is horrible. He really is painted in a bad light, and this is why I believe people tend to brush this prologue off so often, because it's one of the most defining scenes of his character, of all his flaws and of his tendency to discard people the moment he deems them no longer useful. In general, it's crazy how little the prologue is talked when Stannis' character is discussed. Crescent wasn't just some advisor. He was the man who raised him, the closest thing Stannis had to a true father figure. Crescent considered the three brothers his children, loved them and cared for them, and Stannis was the one he loved the most. The line, "You are too ill and too confused to be of use to me, old man," is very cutting, because it shows a very bad side to Stannis' character. He talks to Crescent like he was just a tool, and even if he doesn't want his advice, he could at least be more respectful to the man who raised him and has stayed with him through thick and thin. Instead, Stannis, the moment he perceived him as weak or incapable, he cast him aside, pretty much like Proudwing. And the thing is, Crescent's advice was useful. Stannis refuses to even entertain it, because his pride, his bitterness, and his sheer stubbornness won't allow him to consider anything that isn't entirely on his terms. When he was safe back in his own rooms, Crescent sent the younger man away and limped to his balcony once more, to stand between his gargoyles and stare out to sea. One of Salador's son's warships was sweeping past the castle, her gaily striped hull slicing through the grey-green waters as her oars rose and fell. He watched until she vanished behind a headland. Would that my fears could vanish so easily. Had he lived so long for this? When a maester donned his collar, he put aside the hope of children, yet Crescent had oft felt a father nonetheless. Robert, Stannis, Renly, 3 sons he had raised after the angry sea claimed Lord Steffon. Had he done so ill that now he must watch one kill the other? He could not allow it, would not allow it. Lord Stannis? Stannis turned from the Red Woman, but it was Lady Selise who replied. King, Stannis. You forget yourself, Maester. He is old. His mind wanders, the king told her gruffly. What is it, Crescent? Speak your mind. As you intend to sail, it is vital that you make common cause with Lord Stark and Lady Arryn. I make common cause with no one, Stannis Baratheon said. No more than light makes common cause with darkness, Lady Selise took his hand. Stannis nodded. The Starks seek to steal half my kingdom, even as the Lannisters have stolen my throne and my own sweet brother, the swords and service and strongholds that are mine by rights. They are all usurpers, and they are all my enemies. I have lost him, Crescent thought, despairing. If only he could somehow approach Melisandre unseen. He needed but an instant's access to her cup. You are the rightful heir to your brother Robert, the true lord of the 7 kingdoms, and king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, he said desperately. But even so, you cannot hope to triumph without allies. He has an ally, Lady Selise said. R'hllor, the Lord of Light, the Heart of Fire, the God of Flame and Shadow. Gods make uncertain allies at best, the old man insisted, and that one has no power here. You think not? The ruby at Melisandre's throat caught the light as she turned her head, and for an instant it seems to glow bright as the comet. If you will speak such folly, Maester, you ought to wear your crown again. Yes, Lady Selise agreed. Patch's helm, it suit you well, old man. Put it on again, I command you. Under the sea no one wears hats, Patchface said. I know, oh. Lord Stannis' eyes were shadow beneath his heavy brow, his mouth tight as his jaw worked silently. He always ground his teeth when he was angry. Fool, he growled at last. My lady wife commands. Give Crescent your helm. No, the old maester thought. This is not you. Not your way. You were always just, always hard, yet never cruel. Never. You did not understand mockery no more than you understood laughter. Patchface danced closer, his cowbells ringing. The maester sat silent while the fool set the antlered bucket at his brow. Crescent bowed his head beneath the weight. His bell clanged. Perhaps he ought to sing his counsel henceforth. You go too far, woman, Lord Stannis said. He is an old man, and he served me well. And I will serve you to the last, my sweet lord, my poor lonely son, Crescent thought, for suddenly he saw the way. Stannis became truly angry at this moment, and Crescent, who had known him for years, recognized it immediately. He understood Stannis' habit, his moods, and his reactions better than anyone. What set Stannis off wasn't just Crescent defiance. It was the fact that Crescent seemed to believe in him less than he was used to. That doubt, combined with Crescent's open pushback against Melisandre, was something Stannis could not tolerate because Melisandre is the one who believes in him the most right now. At this point, Stannis genuinely thinks he's Azor Ahai. He isn't just a claimant to the Iron Throne. He is the prophesied savior of the world. He believes he is important. More than that, the most important. And while he stops Elise from further humiliating Crescent, he still gives the order put the hair on. Also, the word again makes me believe it was not the first time that happened, and I do not like that. This moment also highlights something crucial. Stannis isn't just being led by those around him. He's making choices based on his own beliefs, and Selyse is the one that follows him, and not just out of duty as his wife, but because she also truly believes in his destiny. This is an essential dynamic to keep in mind for the rest of the discussion. Then why do we even like Stannis? I think it's a combination of things. First and foremost, I would never doubt any fandom's ability to root for male characters whose fathers didn't take them to see the Black Parade. Or in this case, their brothers. Second, Stannis wasn't justly treated in the past, and that naturally invites sympathy. There's something compelling about a character who has been denied recognition. Stannis was a timid child who grew up in an environment that didn't appreciate that. We don't hear about childhood friends, though I will talk about a rare mention of one later. Nor do we see people supporting him apart from Crescent. During Robert's rebellion, Stannis held Storm's End for a year under siege. Robert and the realm acknowledged Ned for breaking the siege, but it was Stannis who held the castle long enough for that to even be possible. Robert even blamed him because he couldn't capture Daenerys and Viserys when he attacked Dragonstone and the Targaryen fleet. Like it was his fault. Then during the Greyjoy rebellion, Stannis once again carried the crown's efforts. Most of the fighting took place at sea, where the Ironborn had a natural advantage as sailors, just like Stannis, who by then was Robert's master of ships. We also know that Stannis and Jon Arryn were close, working together to fix the debts and chaos Robert was leaving behind. Additionally, Stannis is a much more moral and competent ruler than Robert, and others we've seen in the War of the Five Kings. I don't agree with some of the takes people have about his character, which I'll discuss later, but he does have a moral compass, he takes responsibility, and these qualities naturally invite sympathy and support. Lastly, I think not having access to Stannis' thoughts makes a lot of readers overlook his flaws, thus making him more likable. This brings me to what might be a very unpopular opinion, I don't know. What makes Stannis such a great character in the story is the lack of a POV. He works in contrast to characters like Jaime Lannister and Victarion Greyjoy, both deeply flawed and often unlikable, yet their perspectives gives us insight into their motivations and emotions. We don't necessarily start liking them or rooting for them, but we come to understand them differently. Stannis, on the other hand, would lose a significant part of his weight as a character if we had access to his inner thoughts. He would likely become more unlikable, not less. He gets a big advantage by being shown mostly through the perspectives of two really biased characters. We first meet him through Maester Crescent, and later the main POV we see him through is Davos. And let's be real, a big reason why people like Stannis is because they like Davos. But even through these perspectives, his flaws are pretty obvious. He's bitter, jealous, and petty. He's got a huge sense of entitlement that people tend to brush off. A big part of why he wants to be king isn't just because it's his duty and because of the law, but because he feels like people have been stepping over him and taking what's his through much of his life. He's been treated unfairly at every turn, so now he wants the throne even more. And yeah, he does things that are just. Stannis is nothing if not lawful, but when it comes down to it, he makes the selfish choice more often than people like to admit. What would you have me do, smuggler? Davos considered a moment before he answered. Strike for King's Landing, at once. The king snorted. And leave Storm's End untaken? Sir Courtney does not have the power to harm you. The Lannisters do. A siege would take too long, single combat is too chancy, and an assault would cost thousands of lives with no certainty of success. And there is no need. Once you dethrone Joffrey, this castle must come to you with all the rest. It is said about the camp that Lord Tywin Lannister rushes west to rescue Lannisport from the vengeance of the Northmen. You have a passing clever father, Devan, the king told the boy standing by his elbow. He makes me wish I had more smugglers in my service. And fewer lords. Though you are wrong in one respect, Davos. There is a need. If I leave Storm's End untaken in my rear, it will be said I was defeated here. And that I cannot permit. Men do not love me as they love my brothers. They follow me because they fear me. And defeat is death to fear. The castle must fall. His jaw ground side to side. Aye, and quickly. Doran Martell has called his banners and fortified the mountain passes. His Dornish men are poised to sweep down into the marches. And Highgarden is far from spent. My brother left the greater part of his power at Bitterbridge, near 60,000 foot. I fear that Ser Loras Tyrell reached Bitterbridge before my envoys, and took that host for his own. All the more reason to take King's Landing as soon as we may. Salador's son told me. Salador's son thinks only of gold, Stannis exploded. His head is full of dreams of the treasures he fancies lied under the Red Keep. So let us hear no more of Salador's son. The day I need military counsel from a Lyseni brigand is the day I put off my crown and take the black. The king made a fist. Are you here to serve me, smuggler, or to vex me with arguments? I am yours, Davos said. Then hear me. Stannis isn't thinking about the bigger picture here. Or worse, he is, and just doesn't care. He knows his men will be exhausted, he knows he'll lose people, but he refuses to listen to Davos. Instead, he's annoyed that Davos is giving him advice that doesn't ally with his own ideas. His main concern isn't the well-being of his army, or future more important confrontations, it's his own pride. He's worried that if people say he lost Storm's End, he'll lose their fear. He's so obsessed with his image that he'd rather make a bad tactical move than let people think he lost at Storm's End. The prologue, along with scenes like this one with Davos, where Stannis gets visibly annoyed when he doesn't get the advice he wants, is exactly why he clings to Melisandre so much. Unlike Davos, who straight up tells him, "My lord, what the fuck are you saying?" or Crescent, who knew him as a kid and wasn't afraid to push back, Melisandre isn't really offering him counsel in the same way. She's not challenging him, she's reinforcing him. Instead of giving him advices, she's backing up whatever he already thinks is the right decision and using her powers to make it happen. And if we really pay attention to how Stannis talks about Melisandre and how he acts around her, it's a huge contrast to how he usually is. He's ecstatic that he has her and her magic at his disposal. For once, someone is fully on his corner, telling him he's right. And this is a dynamic that I hardly see being talked about. A lot of discussions about Stannis tend to go, Melisandre is the reason he's doing this, or Melisandre will burn Shireen, Melisandre this, Melisandre that, as if she's the one pulling all the strings. Stannis listens to Melisandre and clings to her because he believes in him, she listens to him, reassures him, and helps him. If she didn't, even with all her power, I doubt Stannis would interact with her in the same way. He listens to her because it tells him he is special and right, because he believes in him in a way no one else ever has. If we actually look at her A Dance with Dragon POV, how much she truly believes in him. And the way Stannis responds to counsel he doesn't like, it's clear that he doesn't blindly listen to her either. He ignores her when he disagrees, just like he ignores Davos or anyone else. The difference is that he's more likely to reconsider her advice, because he knows Melisandre sees him as the most special of the specials. If Melisandre were just a female magical Davos, loyal but without the unwavering belief in his destiny, Stannis wouldn't hold her counsel in the same regard. What happened with Renly, I think, proves that. Stannis wasn't clueless about the Shadow Baby. We don't know exactly what led to that decision, but based on how Stannis talks about it before and after, he knew that whatever they were about to do wasn't going to make Renly suddenly change his mind. Maybe he didn't fully understand the specifics or the consequences, but he knew Renly was most likely going to die. He wanted Renly out of the picture, and Mel provided that. Stannis only seemed to half hear him. I have no doubt that Cersei had a hand in Robert's death. I will have justice for him, and for Ned Stark, and Jon Arryn as well. And for Renly? The words were out before Davos could stop to consider them. For a long time the king did not speak, then very softly he said, "I dream of it sometimes, of Renly's dying. A green tent, candles, a woman screaming, and blood." Stannis looked down at his hands. "I was still abed when he died, your Devan will tell you. He tried to wake me. Dawn was nigh, and my lords were waiting, fretting. I should have been a horse, armored. I knew Renly would attack at break of day. Devan says I thrust and cried out, but what does it matter? It was a dream. I was in my tent when Renly died, and when I woke up, my hands were clean." Sir Davos Seaworth could feel the Fandom fingertips start to itch. Something is wrong here, the one-time smuggler thought. Yet he nodded and said, "I see. Renly offered me a pitch, at our parley, mocked me, defied me, threatened me, and offered me a pitch. I thought he was drawing a blade and went for my own. Was that his purpose? To make me so fear? Or was it one of his pointless jests? When he spoke of how sweet the pitch was, did his words have some hidden meaning?" The king gave a shake of his head, like a dog shaking a rabbit to snap its neck. "Only Renly could vex me so much with a piece of fruit. He brought the doom on himself with his treason. But I did love him, Davos. I know that now. I swear I will go to my grave thinking of my brother's speech." Stannis knows he had a hand in Renly's death. Even if he won't fully admit it, he's regretting it, at least on some level, but he's also still trying to justify it. First his whole tone changes, then he talks about his nightmares, looking at his hands while saying they're clean, and then he starts the whole "he mocked me, he defied me, he committed treason, but I loved him." Even Davos, who sometimes, especially during a Clash of Kings, can go out of his way to rationalize Stannis' choices, can tell something isn't right here. And I think this is how many of his decisions with Melisandre go. Either he already has the idea and Mel make it happen without him knowing the semantics, or he genuinely believes, just like Mel, that he is the chosen one. If this woman, who can literally do magic, is telling him he's Azor Ahai, that she's talking to God, that she has visions, and they need to do X, Y, Z, why wouldn't he believe it or do it? Stannis has a whole magical storyline that barely gets talked about. He's the one character using magic this recklessly and almost daily. Illusions, visions, sacrifices. We love to bring up the one time he said no to burning, but rarely talk about the fact that he's already sacrificed people. When Stannis decided to aid the Night's Watch at the Wall, Melisandre Iphigenia and Alastair Florent, burning him alive to secure favourable winds for their journey to Eastwoods by the Sea. We heard tales that Stannis burned his hand, the hand who went before me. Melisandre had given Alastair Florent to her god on Dragonstone to conjure up the winds that bore them north. Stannis believes in the fire visions. He believes he can wake dragons from stone, and he was ready to sacrifice Edric Storm to do it. And that's the key. If he didn't believe it, I'd like to think he wouldn't be so willing to sacrifice a kid just because it might work. After the others had gone, Davos cleared his throat. The king looked up. "Why are you still here?" "Sire, about Edric Storm." Stannis made a sharp gesture. "Spare me. Your daughter takes her lessons with him and plays with him every day in Aegon's garden. I know that. Her heart would break if anything ill should. I know that as well. If you would only see him. I have seen him. He looks like Robert. Aye, and worships him. Shall I tell him how often his beloved father ever gave him a thought? My brother liked the making of children well enough, but after birth they were a bother. He asks after you every day. You are making me angry, Davos. I will hear no more of this bastard boy. His name is Edric Storm, sire. I know his name. Was there ever a name so apt? It proclaims his bastardy, his high birth, and the turmoil he brings with him. Edric Storm, there, I said it. Are you satisfied, my lord hand? Edric, he started, is one boy. He may be the best boy who ever drew breath, and it would not matter. My duties to the realm. His hand swept across the painted table. How many boys dwell in Westeros? How many girls? How many men? How many women? The darkness will devour them all, she says. The night that never ends, she talks of prophecies, a hero reborn in the sea, leaving dragons' hearts from dead stone. She speaks of signs and swears they point to me. I never asked for this, no more than I asked to be king. Yet dare I disregard her? He ground his teeth. We do not choose our destinies. Yet we must do our duty, no? Great or small, we must do our duty. Melisandre swears that she has seen me in her flames, facing the dark with Lightbringer raised on high. Lightbringer. It glimmers prettily, I'll grant you. But on the black water, this magic sword served me no better than any common steel. A dragon would have turned that battle. Aegon once stood here as I do, looking down on this table. Do you think we would name him Aegon the Conqueror today if he had not had the dragons? Your Grace, the cost. I know the cost. Last night, gazing into the hearth, I saw things in the flames as well. I saw a king, a crown of fire on his brows, burning. Burning, Davos. His own crown consumed his flesh and turned him into ash. Do you think I need Melisandre to tell me what that means? Or you? The king moved so his shadow fell upon King's Landing. If Joffrey should die, what is the life of one bastard boy against a kingdom? Everything, said Davos softly. Stannis looked at him, jaw clenched. Go, the king said at last, before you talk yourself back into the dungeons. The I never asked for this line is a bit hard to buy when you look at Stannis' whole deal. The way he makes decisions just to make a point, or because he refuses to be seen as weak, makes it quite clear that deep down, he does want this. He wants the crown, the recognition, the legacy. He wants the kind of stories people tell about Robert to be told about him. Even in this conversation, he brings up Robert, and how he wasn't as great as people claim. And he's right. Robert was not the great guy many people believed him to be. But that doesn't change the fact that Stannis is very salty, that people still don't support or believe in him the way they supported and love Robert, despite Robert's many, many flaws. Would he be a dutiful king? Absolutely, I don't doubt that he'd rule with justice in mind. But do I believe he isn't at least a little thrilled that Melisandre came in and told him you are the chosen one, you're Azor Ahai, you're the world savior? No way! He eats that up. Also, the way Stannis talks about duty and prophecy here is pretty hypocritical. If you do not believe in gods, why trouble with this new one? Stannis broke in. I have asked myself as well. I know little and care less of gods, but the Red Priestess has power. Yes, but what sort of power? Crescent had wisdom. I trusted in his wisdom and your wiles. And what did they avail me, smuggler? The Stormlords sent you packing. I went to them a beggar, and they laughed at me. Well, there will be no more begging and no more laughing either. The Iron Throne is mine by rights. But how am I to take it? There are 4 kings in the realm, and 3 of them have more men and more gold than I do. I have ships, and I have her, the Red Woman. Half my knights are afraid even to say her name, did you know? If she can do anything else, a sorceress who can inspire such dread in grown men is not to be despised. A frightened man is a beaten man, and perhaps she can do more. I mean to find out. The 7 have never brought me so much as a sparrow. It is time I tried another hawk, Davos. A red hawk. Firstly, when Stannis says perhaps he can do more, I mean to find out, he implies that he has already spoken with Melisandre and knows she might actually be able to remove Renly and the others from the picture with magic. He has some understanding. He was not completely unaware. And second, he's not devout. He's openly stated that he doesn't care about the gods. He follows R'hllor because Melisandre has power and because people fear her. Yet, later, he claims we do not choose our destinies, but we must do our duty. Who exactly is choosing his destiny? Who is making these difficult choices for him that he must simply follow? The law may say he should be king. Fine. But who says he must sacrifice a kid to wake dragons from stone and that he is destined to be the Messiah? Melisandre says that, but she actually believes in R'hllor. Stannis believes in Mel's power and knows he can use her to his advantage. He even mentioned dragons, but he ties them to Blackwater. How a dragon would have helped them at the battle. He doesn't say a life for 1,000 in the end, like he claimed at the start of this rant. He says a boy for a kingdom. Stannis wants to rule. Yes, he would very likely be a decent king, but his claim that he didn't choose any of these and only pursues it out of duty often clashes with what he actually says and does. And this brings me back to the main point from the start of this section. The lack of a POV. Imagine being inside the head of someone so bitter, constantly thinking about his brothers, obsessing over whether people are mocking him, and genuinely believing he's destined for something greater, and how much he was faulted and unappreciated he was and still is. Now add the fact that he has absolutely no idea how magic actually works, but is still willing to use it, because a priest of R'hllor, who can undeniably do magic, is telling him he's the chosen one. No matter how unfairly Stannis was treated in his youth, these traits would make him pretty unlikable over time. And also, we already have this kind of POV. Victarion Greyjoy. If Stannis had a POV, he'd basically be a smarter Victarion. Both are broody second sons, forever stuck in the shadows of their more charismatic older brothers, Robert and Euron. Both are skilled sailors but lack the natural charm that made their siblings natural leaders. Neither has much of a sense of humor, they're bitter, hate James, and have a deep fear of being mocked. They're both stuck in their past, unable to let go, only growing harder and more resentful over time. A demon priest. Might be his robes caught fire, so he jumped overboard to put them out, suggested Longwater Pike to general laughter. Even the monkeys were amused. They chattered overhead, and one flung down a handful of his own shit to splatter on the boards. Victarion Greyjoy mistrusted laughter. The sound of it always left him with an uneasy feeling that he was the butt of some jape he did not understand. Euron Crowseye had oft made mock of him, when they were boys. So had Aeron, before he had become the Damphair. Their mockery oft came disguised as praise, and sometimes Victarion had not even realized he was being mocked, not until he heard the laughter. Then came the anger, boiling up in the back of his throat, until he was like to choke upon the taste. That was how he felt about the monkeys. Their antics never brought so much as a smile to the captain's face, though his crew would roar and hoot and whistle. Send him down to the drowned god before he brings a curse upon us, a ship gone down, and only him clinging to the wreckage. Where's the crew? Did he call down demons to devour them? What happened to the ship? A storm. Moqorro crossed his arms against his chest. He did not appear frightened, though all around him men were calling for his death. Even the monkeys did not seem to like the wizard. They leapt from line to line overhead screaming. Victarion was uncertain. He came out of the sea. Why would the drowned god cast him up, unless he meant for us to find him? His brother Euron had his pet wizards. Perhaps the drowned god meant for Victarion to have one too. Why do you say this man's a wizard? He asked of all. I see only a ragged red priest. And of course, the second biggest similarity between them is their conversion to R'hllor. Stannis is committed to the path of the Red God, and by a dance with dragons, Victarion begins to embrace him as well. But again, not because they truly believe in R'hllor, they believe in the power the priests hold, and how that power can serve their ambitions. Victarion even convinces himself that the drowned god, the one he actually believes in, sent Moqorro to him. If Euron has priests, why shouldn't he? Funnily enough, Robert also had a red priest before Stannis. Well, kind of. Thoros of Myr was close to Robert, but not because of faith, he simply liked the guy. He even fought in a war for no real reason other than that friendship. During Greyjoy's rebellion, Thoros, a frequent drinking companion of Robert, was the first over the wall at Pike wielding a flaming sword. Ironically, the same weapon that became a symbol of R'hllor's champions was once just a tool of Robert's. Victarion has his own Melisandre now, Moqorro. While Moqorro may not claim that Victarion is Azor Ahai, he does believe him to be a crucial part in Daenerys' story. He heals Victarion, even gifting him a magical arm, and guides him through fire visions, much like Melisandre does for Stannis. Come sunset, as the sea turned black as ink, and the swollen sun tinted the sky a deep and bloody red. Victarion came back on deck. He was naked from the waist up, his left arm blood to the elbow. As his crew gathered, whispering and trading glances, he raised a charred and blackened hand. Wisps of dark smoke rose from his fingers as he pointed at the maester. That one. Cut his throat and throw him into the sea, and the wills will favor us all the way to Meereen. Moqorro had seen that in his fires. Victarion even faces the same issue Stannis did, getting his people to accept a red priest. These priests are what give them an advantage, what set them apart from their siblings in their mind. They make them unique, almost lacking their unluckiness. The Iron King and the Iron Suitor. Of black and gold those were, for the arms of House Greyjoy showed a golden kraken on a black field, and the banners and sails on their ships displayed the same. The crimson and scarlet robes of the Red Priest were alien to the Ironborn, but Victarion had hoped his men might accept Moqorro more easily once clad in Greyjoy colours. Again, ironically, the colours of House Greyjoy and House Baratheon are the same, just reversed, black and gold. Watching Stannis' story unfold from an outsider's perspective makes him undeniably more compelling and more likable. The way he's presented follows the classic tragic hero journey, a type of story audiences are naturally drawn to. It's designed to be compelling. I personally love Stannis as a character and love what he brings to the story as well. I feel the same about Victarion, by the way. I really enjoy having them in the novels. That said, I don't feel the way about other similar characters. For example, I recognize that Jaime is written extremely well, but I don't care about him that way. At the same time, I don't necessarily like them for the people they are. Like, their presence in the story is compelling and their arcs are crazy enjoyable to me. But as individuals, they're deeply flawed, often unpleasant, sometimes outright terrifying, assholes, and even stupid. There are moments where I'm thinking, broski, you're screwed, what the hell are you doing or saying? But at the same time, I also find myself rooting for them in a weird, twisted way. That's exactly what makes them so interesting. Stannis Baratheon is a great character the same way Creon from Antigone is a great character. A tragic hero isn't just a guy who fails, he's a man who has everything: power, respect, capability, yet still loses because of who he is. His downfall isn't random, it isn't just bad luck or the gods playing dice. It's built into him from the start. The same traits that make him great are the ones that lead to his destruction. The classic Aristotelian tragic hero is someone of high standing, noble birth, strong presence, a leader. Think kings, generals, warriors. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. And that fall is the whole point. But a tragedy doesn't work if the guy is doomed from the start, at least not exactly. He is doomed, but the audience has to believe, at least for a moment, that he could win, that things could go his way until they don't. And when it all crashes down, it's not just his life that gets wrecked. The tragedy of one great man becomes the tragedy of his people, his city, his family, and what actually dooms him is himself. The tragic hero has a fatal flaw, something deeply ingrained in his nature that pushes him toward ruin. And most of the time, it's something that in another context would have been his greatest strength. Oedipus is relentless in his pursuit of truth, until the truth destroys him. Macbeth is ambitious, a man who could have been a great king, if only he hadn't tried to take it by force. Agamemnon is proud and sees himself as the ultimate authority, until that arrogance gets him murdered in his own bath. Ivris, excessive pride, is the classic one, especially in Greek tragedies, but tragic flaws can be anything. Obsession, stubbornness, the inability to let go. At some point, the hero hits a reversal of fortune. He was on top, now he's falling. Maybe he realizes it, maybe he doesn't, but what matters is that by the time he does, it's too late. This is the moment of recognition, where the hero understands what happened and why. And here's the real tragedy: he usually sees it with perfect clarity, but it's too late. Oedipus finally gets it. Macbeth sees exactly what he's become. Even someone like Creon in Antigone realizes too late that his rigid enforcement of the law has cost him everything. The hero doesn't just fall, he understands why he's falling, and that's what makes it hit harder. And this is why these characters are more often than not great characters. Lastly, we see the consequences. The hero faces the full force of his own mistakes, and there's no escape. His suffering is excessive, way beyond what seems fair many times, but that's tragedy for you. And through this, the audience feels catharsis. That mix of pity, fear, and relief. Pity because the hero tried and failed. Fear because it could have happened to anyone. Relief because the story ends with the restoration of order. Even if the hero is gone, the world continues just without him in it. Tragic characters are everywhere. They can be heroes, anti-heroes, villains, Walter White, Anakin Skywalker, even someone like Michael Corleone. Men who start with potential but are undone by their own nature. Tragedy works because it's not about good versus evil, it's about a man against himself. And when he loses, it feels inevitable. Parenthesis. As you probably noticed, I didn't mention tragic heroines at all here, and that is because they rarely, if ever, follow the same pattern with their male counterparts, at least the classic archetypes. In the most used example, the myth of Lavdacus family, where we see Oedipus and Creon, we also see Iocaste, Ismene, and of course Antigone in various plays of Sophocles. Male tragic heroes often embody themes of pride and moral decline, their downfall stemming from their own flaws, avarice, ambition, or an unyielding sense of justice. Their tragedy is internal, a consequence of their choices and convictions. Female tragic characters, on the other hand, struggle against external forces just as much, if not more. Societal expectations, restrictive gender roles, and the fight for personal freedom. Their fates are shaped by a world that refuses to grant them agency, making their tragedies about personal flaws, as well as about an inevitable clash between individual desire and societal constraint. This contrast highlights how gender influences not only a character's evolution, but the very structure of their downfall. Clini parenthesis. Stannis is a masterclass in modern tragic characters. His strengths are also his biggest weaknesses. Stannis turned to study him. Beneath his heavy brow were eyes like bottomless blue pools. His hollow cheeks and strong jaw were covered with a short-cropped blue-black beard that did little to conceal the gauntness of his face. And his teeth were clenched. His neck and shoulders were clenched as well, and his right hand. Jon found himself remembering something Donald Noy once said about the Baratheon brothers. Robert was the true steel. Stannis is pure iron, black and hard and strong, but brittle, the way iron gets. He'll break before he bends. Uneasily he knelt, wondering why this brittle king had need of him. That line from Donald Noy sums him up perfectly. Stannis is strong, but he's brittle. Even in Jon's description, we see a man constantly on the verge of breaking. His body is tense, his jaw clenched, his every muscle stiff with strain, like he's seconds away from snapping. Stannis is powerful, determined, and unyielding, but that very inflexibility is what makes him fragile. He refuses to bend, refuses to compromise, refuses to let things go, and that's exactly what makes his downfall inevitable. Stannis is trapped in the past. He constantly speaks of a brother who had been dead for years and of injustices done to him in the past. The gods did not make you a man, how can I? Stannis turned back to the night fire and whatever he saw dancing there amongst the orange flames. Sir Justin Massey grasped Asha by the arm and pulled her inside the royal tent. That was ill-judged, my lady, he told her. Never speak to him of Robert. I should have known better, as I knew how it went with little brothers. She remembered Theon as a boy, a side child who lived in awe and fear of Roderick and Maron. They never grow out of it, she decided. A little brother may be lived to be 100, and he will always be a little brother. Stannis shares a crucial trait with characters like Lady Stoneheart and John Connington. His heart is cold and his mind is consumed by the past. Revenge, justice, and duty are all he has left. And while we sympathize with them, how could we not? George Martin often highlights how this inability to move forward only leads to ruin. If not outright criticizing this mindset, he at least makes it clear that being trapped in the past serves neither the character nor those around them in the long run. I mean, fire is love, fire is passion, fire is sexual ardor, and all of those things. Ice is betrayal, ice is revenge, ice is, that kind of cold inhumanity, and all that stuff is being played out in the books. We see this cold inhumanity in Stannis, constantly. He is often described in a very otherworldly and not in a very flattering way. It can sound cool, some of the descriptions are badass, but still they are definitely not there to flatter him. He was always summoned for feasts, seated near the salt close to Lord Stannis. His lord's face swam up before him, not the man he was, but the boy he had been, standing cold in the shadows while the sun shone on his elder brother. Whatever he did, Robert had done first and done better. Poor boy, he must hurry for his sake. In truth, Renly Baratheon did not frighten Tyrion half so much as his brother Stannis did. Renly was beloved of the commons, but he had never before led men in war. Stannis was otherwise. Hard, cold, inexorable. If only they had some way of knowing what was happening on Dragonstone. But no one of the fisherfolk he had paid to spy out the island had ever returned. And even the informers the eunuch claimed to have placed in Stannis' household had been ominously silent. As the long fingers of dawn fan across the fields, colour was returning to the world. Where grey men had sat grey horses armed with shadow spears, the points of 10,000 lances now gleamed in silver gold, and on the myriad flapping banners Catelyn saw the blush of red and pink and orange, the richness of blues and browns, the blaze of gold and yellow. All the power of Storm's End and Highgarden, the power that had been Renly's an hour ago, they belong to Stannis now, she realized, even if they do not know it themselves yet. Where else are they to turn, if not to the last Baratheon? Stannis has won all with a single evil stroke. Stannis' description closely mirror those of the others. We literally have him being described as a cold shadow and a cold breath. Lies. Lady Catelyn was there when his grace was murdered. There was a shadow, the candles guttered, and the air grew cold, and there was blood. Oh, very good, Jaime laughed. Your wits are quicker than mine, I confess it. When they found me standing over my dead king, I never thought to say, no, it wasn't me, it was a shadow. A terrible cold shadow. Catelyn could still hear Stannis saying that Rob's turn too would come in time. It was like a cold breath on the back of your neck. When the time comes, I will not hold you back. Even Stannis' sense of duty and justice is wrapped in a coldness that is deeply unnerving. Yes, leaders must make difficult choices and bear blood on their hands, but Stannis is quick to throw people under the bus if that's what it takes, because it is his duty. And he does it with an almost unsettling lack of emotions. Even he describes the crown and kingship as cold. He knows people do not like him and simply accept it, and says cool fear it is. Like this is something to aspire to. You can't please everyone, obviously. But Stannis takes it to the extreme. He doesn't give a shit whether he pleases anyone at all. And considering his reputation and some of the laws he wanted to pass, he isn't that liked by the small folk either, like Renly, for example, who by the way are the kingdom. Edric Storm, Davos said. Stannis rounded on him in a cold fury. I know his name. Spare me your reproaches. I like this no more than you do, but my duty is to the realm. Stannis ground his teeth again. I never asked for this crown. Gold is cold and heavy on the head. But so long as I am the king, I have a duty. If I must sacrifice one child to the flames to save 1,000,000 from the dark, sacrifice is never easy, Davos, or it is no true sacrifice. Like iron, hard ice is again hard and brittle. Stannis is cold and hard as ice. Even things typically associated with fire and warmth, like gold, anger, and wrath, are stripped of their heat when tied to him. Gold, so often described as molten or glowing like the sun, becomes heavy and cold upon his head. And yes, this goes both ways. Ruling is hard, and rulers should constantly be reminded of that weight. But ruling with pure coldness isn't always the best path either. His fury and anger, instead of burning, are also cold. And it burns. It does. Nothing burns like the cold. And of course, Stannis' biggest mistake, one he's already committed, is trying to fulfill a prophecy we know isn't meant for him. Trying to force a prophecy into reality is one of the oldest tragic downfalls in literature, from Sophocles to Shakespeare, and it's a theme George Martin also uses. Even the mythical figures Stannis parallels don't exactly have shining legacies. And I'm not just talking about Azor Ahai, though there are theories that he was a villain, but rather than the figures often tied to Azor Ahai, the Night King and the Bloodstone Emperor, men who believed themselves to be chosen, who may have also tried to fulfill a prophecy, and like Stannis, they weren't saviors. From an outsider's perspective, Stannis is Bloodstone reborn, and Melisandre is his Tiger Woman. Bloodstone is said to have killed his sister, the Amethyst Empress. He practiced torture, dark arts, and necromancy. He enslaved his people, took a Tiger Woman for his wife, feasted on human flesh, and cast down the true gods of Yeti to worship a black stone that fell from the sky. To the casual Westerosi, Stannis is no different. He killed his own brother, keeps a sorceress at his side and treats her as he does his wife. He casts down the seven, burns sept and statues of the gods, and worships a new god that demands sacrifices he readily provides. Stannis rules from a grim, dark, haunted castle that stinks of sorcery, full of rooms, turnpike stairs, and stony passages. My mistake? Stannis is ruling two grim, dark, haunted castles that stink of sorcery, Dragonstone and Nightford. His Grace has taken the Nightford for his seat. In the south he holds Storm's End and Dragonstone. Castles that are described as dark, stony, grim, and full of ghosts, but with a big difference. One is burning, and the other is cold. The castle he took from the Dragon Lords, but he never really liked, a castle he left behind to follow his destiny, and now he is ruling from a different black castle, one the Dragon Lords shut down, but he has taken as his seat with a magical woman at his side. And suddenly Stannis starts to sound along like the Night King. He has also given both his seed and his soul. He impregnated Melisandre to create a cold shadow, one that murdered his own blood. The Night King provided sacrifices to the others, just as Stannis does for Allure. And yes, Melisandre is obviously the polar opposite of the Corpse Queen, but only on the surface. Melisandre is a naturally red and hot with eyes like burning red stars, just as the Corpse Queen was a naturally white and cold with eyes like burning blue stars. And Stannis' relationship with Melisandre is similarly highly controversial, not for the same reasons, but because he is already married. Not that people would be thrilled if he weren't and had suddenly married Melisandre out of nowhere, don't get me wrong. Melisandre may be fiery, but the shadow they cast is dark and cold. And since I've brought up darkness, I have to address the bane of my existence once again. Unfortunately, Game of Thrones is so deeply intertwined with canon in the fandom's collective mind that especially when discussing character analysis, it's almost impossible to avoid. So let's talk about one of the more controversial scenes in Game of Thrones. The sacrifice of Shireen Baratheon at the hands of your father. A scene that sparked a debate that still hasn't died down. Stannis wouldn't do that, burning his daughter is so out of character. For show Stannis, maybe, I guess, though even in the show it would have worked with the right build-up. But this argument isn't just limited to the show. It gets thrown around when discussing the books too. Scroll through Reddit, forums, YouTube videos, even meme comments, and you'll find people insisting that Stannis would never do that, despite George Martin straight up saying that Shireen's sacrifice wasn't some random D&D invention. There are plenty of dumb moments in the show that the showrunners themselves admitted were their own ideas, even explaining how they came up with them. And we know that George has said he was out of the loop on certain things, especially in the later seasons, where he was largely, if not entirely, uninvolved. But this one was not one of those moments. It was actually one of the 3 major plot points he revealed to the showrunners about the ending and future book events. It wasn't easy for me. I didn't want to give away my books. It's not easy to talk about the end of my books. Every character has a different end. I told them who would be on the Iron Throne, and I told them some big twists like Hodor and Hold the Door, and Stannis' decision to burn his daughter. I'm fairly certain that if George Martin had never revealed that this is Stannis' future in the novels, people would be arguing endlessly about how there's no way it would happen because it's so not in character for Stannis. Even now, with George Martin's confirmation, things like "I wish this didn't happen," which, yeah, totally valid, it's a horribly brutal and sad moment, are thrown around all the time, but then you also get takes like "this better make sense in the books," when it already does. Stannis, like nearly every character in the series, was changed. Yet as with many other characters, fans often stick with the show's version of him, even when discussing the books. His storyline was drastically cut down and changed, with one of the most crucial aspects of his arc, magic, once again being downplayed. Stannis' presence in the show was so wasted that honestly the only reason people still say he was great in Game of Thrones is because of Stephen Delane and his incredible acting chops, which were severely underutilized. And while we did get some great scenes, that doesn't change the fact that Stannis' entire storyline was gutted. So many crucial moments, dialogues, and character-defining decisions were cut or changed, scenes that Delane would have absolutely nailed, and it's a shame they never came to be. A huge reason why people have a skewed view of Stannis in the novels is because of Delane. They liked the portrayal and the actor, so they stuck with his version. It was not because the writing for So Stannis was particularly strong and overshadowed that of the books. The man is just ridiculously charismatic and incredibly talented. He made people care about So Stannis despite the fact that his character was a stripped down and watered down version of the original. I'd argue that Stannis didn't just gradually go downhill as the show progressed. He was mischaracterized from the start, so his downfall didn't make sense. The prologue of A Clash of Kings, along with half of Stannis' rants, were horribly adapted, if they were even adapted at all. They tried to keep some of Stannis' defining traits, his jealousy towards his brothers, his fear of being mocked, but they were mostly passing moments. Thing is, they aren't. They are a constant presence, and they influence his decisions, relationships, and interactions throughout the entire story, from A Clash of Kings to A Dance with Dragons. Stannis' relationships with Melisandre and Selyse are very important in the novels, yet the show made changes that created weird differences, and also they altered Stannis' relationship with Davos and Shireen, as well as Davos' relationship with Shireen. Reading the source material, it becomes clear that a major reason people like Stannis is Davos. And this is exactly what the show tried to take advantage of. But I'm not sure they did it on purpose. I think they fell into the same trap we as readers often do when reading Davos chapters. The show presented Stannis the way Davos perceived him, not necessarily who he really is. Because of course Stannis doesn't have a POV. But, and it's a big but, they portrayed Stannis exactly as Davos sees him, even when Davos wasn't on screen. They altered key dialogues, scenes and characters, and events that even from a biased perspective showcase a much more morally grey and unlikable Stannis in the books. In the novels, being in Davos' head gives us a biased opinion, but it also makes it clear that Stannis isn't just some noble misunderstood king. Stannis' own words often contradict Davos' view of him. Something extremely important to note is that we never see Stannis along with Shireen, and we also never see him along with Melisandre. I'll get to Shireen in a moment, but when it comes to Mel, that's the whole intrigue of the relationship. It largely happens off-screen. We hear things, but we aren't shown everything. We don't actually know how Stannis and Melisandre interact in private exactly. And if we go by what we do know, I'd argue the show didn't handle it well at all. Stannis doesn't have a POV, that's the whole point of the character. For better or worse, trying to give him scenes alone with characters where we have no real insight into how he interacts in private isn't a smart move. Most of what we know about him comes from Crescent, Davos, and later from Asha and Jon. Theon and Melisandre will likely become even more important perspectives on Stannis in the future books, but for now we have a very limited pool of people giving us insight into him. Every other character in the novels gives a very surface level but consistent picture of Stannis. Very capable, very unlikable, very stiff, and prudish. Which is actually pretty hypocritical of Stannis if we take a closer look at what we know about him and Melisandre. Stannis' main POV is Davos, so much so that many of the traits we associate with Stannis actually come from Davos' own ideals and biases. Davos believes in Stannis, he sees him as just and honorable, which to an extent he is, but he also downplays his flaws. He also tends to be stuck, like Crescent, in the image of Stannis he held from the past, the 18-year-old who cut off his fingers and changed his life. In that way, he's actually very similar to Ned, clinging to a version of someone that might not exist anymore. Sadly, like Robert, Stannis only seems to get worse with the years. But because we experience Stannis through Davos' eyes, we're naturally inclined to take his word for it. But the reality of Stannis' character is far more complex, and at times much harsher than the version Davos presents. This made Stannis appear more principled and sympathetic than the one in the books. In fact, many traits fans attribute to Stannis are mostly defining traits of Davos, which are then reflected back onto Stannis. He's the one doing everything for his family and because of duty and honor towards Stannis all the time, for example. That's because Davos is a biased Stannis supporter. He truly believes in Stannis, sees his potential, and wants him to succeed, so he blames Melisandre for everything, when Stannis has as much of a responsibility as her. And since Davos is one of the more likable and generally good people in the story, readers naturally trust his perspective. If Davos believes in Stannis, then Stannis must be worth of that belief. If he doesn't like Melisandre, then Melisandre is bad, right? You do not love the woman, I know that, Davos. I am not blind. My lords mislike her too. Estermont thinks the flaming heart ill-chosen, and begs to fight beneath the crowned stag as of old. Sir Gaiard said a woman should not be my standard-bearer. Others whisper that she has no place in my war councils, that I ought to send her back to Asai, that it is sinful to keep her in my tent of a night. Aye, they whisper, while she serves. Serves how? Davos asked, dreading the answer. As needed. The king looked at him, and you? I am yours to command. What would you have me do? Nothing you have not done before. Only a land abode beneath a castle unseen in the black of night. Can you do that? Yes, tonight? The king gave a curt nod. You will need a small boat, not Black Betha. No one must know what you do. Davos wanted to protest. He was a knight now, no longer a smuggler, and he had never been an assassin. Yet when he opened his mouth, the words would not come. This was Stannis, his just lord, to whom he owed all he was, and he had his sons to consider as well. Gods be good. What has he done to him? You are quiet, Stannis observed, and should remain so, Davos told himself, yet instead he said, My liege, you must have the castle, I see that now, but surely there are other ways. Cleaner ways. Let Sir Courtney keep the bastard boy, and he may well yield. I must have the boy, Davos. Must. Melisandre has seen that in the flames as well. Storm's End holds no knight who can match Sir Gaiard or Lord Caron, or any of 100 others sworn to your service. This single combat, could it be that Sir Courtney seeks for a way to yield with honor, even if it means his own life? A troubled look crossed the king's face like a passing cloud. More like he planned some treachery. There will be no combat of champions. Sir Courtney was dead before he even threw that glove. The flames do not lie, Davos. Yet they require me to make them true, he thought. It had been a long time since Davos Seaworth felt so sad. Davos believes in Stannis doesn't mean Stannis actually aligns with all the values Davos sees in him, at least not all the time, and sadly, maybe not anymore. He should not have chopped any of your fingers, the lad decided. That was ill done. I was a smuggler. Yes, but you smuggled him fish and onions. Lord Stannis knighted me for the onions, and took my fingers for the smuggling. He pulled his gloves back on. My father would not have chopped your fingers. Davos helped Stannis, and unlike any other highborn, Stannis helped Davos. Punished him, sure, but also rewarded him, changing his life and his family's. Stannis could have easily just said, "Go away, I'm not cutting your fingers off, but don't expect anything either." Instead, he upheld his sense of justice, cutting Davos' fingers off because he was a smuggler, but at the same time acknowledging the worth of what he had done. Davos saved Stannis and his people, and in return Stannis helped him, giving him and his family a better life. Now, watching Stannis go down this path is sad for Davos. Stannis is asking him to go back to doing something he was once punished for. Something that in another time Stannis would have considered dishonorable. Smuggling was Davos' entire life, not out of choice, but necessity. He gained skill through it that he's proud of, but he was never exactly proud of being a smuggler. Davos pulled his glove on, wishing he had not lost his luck. He had been a better man and a braver one, with that bag of bones around his neck. He considers the finger bones luck, because since he stopped being a smuggler and his fingers were cut off, his life changed. His family's life changed. Davos loves his family and is so proud that his children didn't follow the path he did in his youth. He found the maester seated at his long wooden table covered with books and scrolls, across from the three children. Princess Shireen sat between the two boys. Even now, Davos could take great pleasure in the sight of his own blood, keeping company with a princess and a king's bastard. Devan would be a lord now, not merely a knight. The Lord of the Rain would. Davos took more pride in that than in wearing the title himself. He reads too. He reads and he writes, as if he had been born to it. Pylos had not but praise for his diligence, and the master at arms said Devan was showing promise with sword and lance as well. And he is a godly lad too. My brothers have ascended to the Hall of Light to sit beside the Lord, Devan has said, when his father told him how his 4 elder brothers had died. I will pray for them at the night fires, and for you as well, father, so you might walk in the light of the Lord till the end of your days. Now Davos is being pulled back into that, not by necessity, but by the same man who once punished him for it. He's sad because he sees Stannis going down a path he doesn't agree with, and because Stannis is dragging him down with him. He told him to smuggle Melisandre in the castle, knowing that his own brother would most likely die. And not an honorable death either. It is clear that Stannis was okay with the plan they devised, and he was actually anticipating to see if indeed the spell Melcast could work. Davos blames Melisandre, ignoring the fact that Stannis, along with all his virtues, like his strong sense of justice, has flaws that led him to embrace what Melisandre offers. Melisandre hasn't enchanted Stannis. She came to him and said, I saw it in my flames, my god sent me to help you, and we know from her POV that she genuinely believes in him. Melisandre, a former slave, who gained power through the lore, needs to believe in her god. She cannot even consider that she might be wrong about Stannis, because that would mean questioning everything her life is built around. Stannis embraces her belief because, for most of his life, doing everything right only got him ignored, dismissed, or even blamed. So why not take the easy way out? The others do it all the time, why not him? Why not listen to the woman who says you're the chosen one and can actually back it up with magic? It's tragic, but Stannis' downfall isn't Melisandre's fault. Not mainly anyway. Davos just borrowed Ned Stark's rose-tinted glasses for Baratheon brothers. The show, and honestly most of the fandom, borrowed the same glasses, and that framing played a huge role into pushing the classic argument, this is all Melisandre's fault, rather than Stannis made his decision, and it was a bad one. In the book, Stannis and Melisandre's relationship is far more codependent, and this is exactly why, especially late seasons Melisandre, doesn't make much sense either. Book Melisandre, like Stannis, is a far more complex and interesting character than what we got in the TV series. In the books, both Davos and Melisandre want Stannis to succeed, but their approaches are different. Davos isn't certain of victory. He simply believes in Stannis and wants to support him for all the reasons stated above. Stannis and Melisandre, on the other hand, treat the war as if victory is inevitable, since they have seen it in the flames. They just need to find the right path to achieve it. And that mindset can be incredibly dangerous. For what it's worth, Stannis absolutely has main character syndrome. He spent his whole life as the second son, the one who followed orders, who held the line, who did everything right, and got no recognition for it. The sidekick, the overlooked brother. So when Melisandre came along and told him, "You're not just important, you're the hero, the chosen one, the literal savior of the world," it's not hard to imagine something just clicking. I am sorry, but this is not Mel's fault. Θα γίνω η γιαγιά μου τώρα. Αν κάποιος σου πει να πας να πηδήξεις από τον γκρεμό, θα πας. It is also important to notice that the show removed several characters which changed the dynamic between Stannis and mostly Davos. One of the biggest omissions was the near-complete removal of the Florents, Sely's family. In the books, they were crucial allies after the capture of Storm's End, and Stannis entrusted them with several important positions. But in the show, many of those roles were instead given to Davos, which altered the perception of Stannis' leadership. A perfect example of this is the Siege of Storm's End and the Battle of the Blackwater. In the books, as we saw before, Davos advises Stannis during the Siege of Storm's End, including giving his opinion on Melisandre. He is present when Stannis parleys with Courtnay Penrose, and when Penrose refuses to surrender, Davos urges Stannis to leave for King's Landing. But Stannis, unwilling to accept defeat, instead orders Davos to smuggle Melisandre beneath Storm's End. When they later prepare to attack King's Landing, Stannis appoints Imry Florent, his fleet commander. The book makes it painfully clear that Imry was incompetent and familiar with the area and ignored the advice of both Davos and Salandor's son simply because they weren't highborn Westerosi lords. Davos could make out Fury well to the southeast, her sails simmering golden as they came down, the crowned stag of Baratheon, blazoned on the canvas. From the deck, Stannis Baratheon had commanded the assault on Dragonstone 16 years before, but this time he had chosen to ride with his army, trusting Fury and the command of his fleet to his wife's brother Ser Imry, who'd come over to his cause at Storm's End with Lord Alastair and all the other Florents. During the Battle of Blackwater, Stannis' forces already had major disadvantages like the weather and the treacherous waters, but one of the biggest issues was the incompetence of the lords Stannis entrusted with leadership. Davos, on the other hand, knew the waters of King's Landing better than almost anyone. He had been a smuggler, he knew the currents, the tides, the hidden dangers. He even tried to advise Imry to send scouts ahead, but Imry refused because their fleet was bigger. Blackwater was lost for many reasons, and bad leadership was undeniably one of them, and even if we see Stannis say, "Curse that fool of Laurent, who sailed my fleet into the jaws of a trap," he still was the one who made him an admiral. The show changes this. There Davos urges Stannis to leave for King's Landing after the Shadow Baby incident. Stannis tasks him with smuggling Melisandre into the caves beneath Renly's camp, where Davos witnesses her giving birth to the Shadow Baby, and of course, freaks the fuck out. After Stannis gains many of Renly's former allies and reinforces his fleet at Dragonstone, Davos advises him to march for King's Landing as quickly as possible, and to leave Melisandre behind because people believe she is controlling him. This angers Stannis, but ultimately it doesn't matter. He still listens to Davos and in the end names him commander of the fleet for the Battle of Blackwater Bay, even though Davos is concerned that Stannis' bannermen will not respect him because he is a lowborn and an ex-smuggler. Imry is still kinda there, but Davos is named the commander by Stannis. This may seem like small changes made to streamline the show's cast and plot, but they alter Stannis' characterization. And that becomes even more obvious when comparing how he interacts with Melisandre in the show versus the books upon his return. But Miss Cat, we don't know how he interacted with Mel in the books, you just said it 5 minutes ago. Exactly. That's the whole point. That's the intrigue. We can tell that Stannis and Melisandre have a strange dynamic. His comments give us some insight, but not enough to justify the kind of scenes the show gave us. The show constantly flip-flopped on Stannis' beliefs. One moment he's completely devoted to Melisandre's vision, and the next he's struggling her in frustration. In the books it's much more vague, which makes it infinitely more interesting. After the Blackwater, Stannis names Alastair Florent as his hand, and refuses to see anyone but Mel. He isolates himself in the stone drum, barely eating, barely sleeping, just brooding, like in the show. But all we get are rumors. Rumors that he goes with Melisandre down into the volcano to watch the fires, not just some bonfire in the dungeons, but Dragonmont. We don't even know if it's true, but it adds so much more mystery and depth to the story. I cannot stress enough, but we don't know exactly how Stannis interacts with Melisandre behind closed doors. But his later comments suggest that he doesn't blame her for the Blackwater. The truth now, why did you wish to murder Lady Melisandre? So he does know. Davos could not lie to him. 4 of my sons burned on the Blackwater. She gave them to the flames. You wrong her. Those fires were no work of hers. Curse the imp, curse the pyromancers, curse that fool of Florent who sailed my fleet into the jaws of a trap. Or curse me, for my stubborn pride, for setting her away when I needed her most. But not Melisandre. She remains my faithful servant. Maester Crescent was your faithful servant. She slew him and she killed Sir Courtenay Penrose and your brother Renly. Now you sound a fool, the king complained. The show has Stannis violently confronting Melisandre, which doesn't make sense, because one moment he is ready to kill her, then she tells him to look into the flames, and the next he's suddenly all in as if he's just now seeing the light. It's rushed and shallow, and this is a pattern with Stannis as well. His magical storyline is a mess. And where you combine this with how his dialogues and monologues are often changed, sadly or not, the result is a very different version of Stannis from the one in the books. Davos being lowborn, a former smuggler, yet highly competent, is something people often praise Stannis for, how he values ability over birth. And that's true, but this idea often gets a little twisted as well. Stannis undeniably respects Davos and considers him a valuable ally, because Davos saved his life. But he doesn't listen to him nearly as much as the show implies, nor does he entrust him with every major decision. And while Stannis does value Davos' competence, another huge reason he keeps him close is that Davos helped him and believes in him. Something highborn lords have rarely done by choice. Once again, there's an underlying bitterness, pettiness, and self-interest at play. It's not just about merit, both can be true at the same time. Cold water, cups for 2. Davos, attend me. My lady, I shall send for you, when I require you. As the king commands, Melisandre bowed. After the brightness of the morning, the interior of the pavilion seemed cool and dim. Stannis seated himself on a plain wooden campstool, and waved Davos to another. One day I may make you my lord, smuggler. If only to eat Celtigar and Florent. You will not thank me, though. It will mean you must suffer through these councils and pay interest in the braying of mules. I love how petty Stannis can be. That doesn't change the fact that he appointed Florent as admiral during Blackwater, and that was stupid, and how there is this bitter pettiness that drives his actions, as well as law and justice. The complete removal of Pylos in the show also altered things. Instead, the show built a grandfatherly relationship between Davos and Shireen. While this led to some great emotional and cute moments, it halted Davos' character development, which is arguably just as important, if not more so, than Stannis. Davos' growth is closely tied to his conversations and lessons with Maester Pylos, where he begins to understand his own worth. If there is someone in Stannis' crew that cares about the kingdom and would put loyalty and justice above all, it is Davos, way more than Stannis ever does. As a former smuggler who has been looked down upon his entire life, Davos has internalized a big sense of inferiority. This transformation could never be fully achieved with Shireen, as she is a child. He cannot have the same discussions with her as he could have with an adult. Pylos serves as a mentor, who helps Davos break free from this mindset that birth determines worth, allowing him to embrace his role as a Hand of the King. Which is great, because if there's one thing good about the Order of the Maesters, is that even though they are sexist, they are not classist. Since being a Maester is not limited to highborn men only. But I cannot read nor write. Maester Pylos can read for you. As to writing, my last hand wrote the hair of his shoulders. All I ask of you are the things you've always given me: honesty, loyalty, service. Surely there is someone better, some great lord. Onions, says Davos glumly. This is what he has in me. The king's hand should be a highborn lord, someone wise and learned, a battle commander or a great knight. Sir Aim Redwine was the greatest knight of his time, and one of the worst hands ever to serve a king. Septums Marminson's prayers worked miracles, but as Hand he soon had the whole realm praying for his death. Lord Barrowell was renowned for wit, Miles Smallwood for courage, Sir Otto Hightower for learning, yet they failed as hands. Everyone. As for birth, the Dragon Kings oft chose hands from amongst their own blood, with results as various as Baelor Breakspear and Maegor the Cruel. Against this you have Septon Barth, the blacksmith's son, the old king plucked from the Red Keep's library, who gave the realm 40 years of peace and plenty. Pylos smiled. Read your history, Lord Davos, and you will see that your doubts are groundless. How can I read history when I cannot read? This also leads to a scene that highlights how the image of Stannis as a dutiful king serving his subjects, rather than himself, is something largely pushed onto him by Davos. Davos consistently frames Stannis as a just ruler who prioritizes the realm above all else, but this belief doesn't necessarily reflect reality, at least not all the time, and at some point even Davos mentioned this to him. She talks of cows, Davos told the king. I am speaking of a boy, your daughter's friend, your brother's son. A king's son, with the power of king's blood in his veins. Melisandre's ruby glowed like a red star at her throat. Do you think you've saved this boy, Onion Knight? When the long night falls, Edric Storm shall die with the rest. Wherever he is hidden, your own sons as well, darkness and cold will cover the earth. You meddle in matters you do not understand. There's much I don't understand, Davos admitted. I have never pretended elsewise. I know the seas and rivers and shapes of the coast where the rocks and shoals lie. I know hidden coves where a boat can land unseen. And I know that a king protects his people, or he is no king at all. Stannis' face darkened. Do you mock me to my face? Must I learn a king's duty from an onion smuggler? Davos knelt. If I have offended, take my head. I'll die as I lived, your loyal man. But hear me first. Hear me for the sake of the onions I brought you, and the fingers you took. Stannis lit Lightbringer from its cupboard. Its glow filled the chamber. Say what you will, but say it quickly. The muscle in the king's neck stood out like cords. Davos fumbled inside his cloak and drew out the crinkled sheet of pergament. It seemed a thin and flimsy thing, yet it was all the shield he had. A king's hand should be able to read and write. Maester Pylos has been teaching me. He smoothed the letter flat upon his knee and began to read by the light of the magic sword. Stannis does have a strong sense of justice, but he is also deeply self-centered and self-righteous. He even admits that to Jon Snow. Surprisingly, Stannis smiled at that. You're bold enough to be a Stark. Yes, I should have come sooner. If not from my hand, I might not have come at all. Lord Seaworth is a man of humble birth, but he reminded me of my duty, when all I could think of was my rights. I had the cart before the horse, Davos said. I was trying to win the throne to save the kingdom, when I should have been trying to save the kingdom to win the throne. Stannis pointed north. There is where I'll find the foe that I was born to fight. Stannis has a remarkable way of stating things so that even when he acknowledges a truth we agree with, he sadly reframes it in a way that makes it about himself. In this moment, he gives Davos his flowers for helping him see his duty, his real duty, protecting the kingdom and his subjects, yet he immediately pivots back to his own sense of destiny. Even when he acknowledges he was too focused on his rights over his duty, he immediately reframes it in a way that still pulls himself in the center. It's not just about saving the kingdom anymore, it's about him being the one born to fight this great enemy. Another important character that did not make the cut is Patchface. By removing Patch, they removed many important moments like Stannis giving his hat to Crescent, which made the old man's humiliation even worse. Plus, Patchface is another source of prophecy, and his eerie, cryptic, creepy little songs were a big part of the story that the show just erased. Songs that often ally with Melisandre's visions, but instead of pointing to victory, they hint at loss. Azor Ahai, beloved of R'hllor, the warrior of light, the son of fire, come forth, your sword awaits you, come forth and take it in your hand. Stannis Baratheon strode forward like a soldier marching into battle. His squire stepped up to attend him. Davos watched as his son Devan pulled a long padded glove over the king's right hand. The boy wore a cream-colored doublet with a fiery heart hewn on the breast. Brian Faring was similarly garbed, as he tied a stiff leather cape around his grey's neck. Behind, Davos heard a faint clank and clatter of bells. Under the sea, smoke rises in bubbles, and flames burn green and blue and black. Patchface sang somewhere, I know, oh, oh, oh. Even though Stannis in the series was played exceptionally well by Stephen T. Lane, the way the show wrote him only made the writer's job more difficult. They simplified the dynamics between all the characters by changing events and dialogues, often making Stannis seem like he was torn between Davos, his conscience, and Melisandre, his corruption. But in the book, Stannis isn't passive. He's not caught between two opposing forces, helplessly pulled in either direction. There is a reason he holds both Davos and Melisandre in such high regard. He actively makes his own choices, driven by both his principles and his personal grievances. Because, 1, he's a human, and 2, if he were just some sad and angry king easily manipulated by a seductive witch, he'd be a terrible character. Same goes for the idea of him being this beacon of morals, the king who cares, the broody, antisocial, and ultimately loving father, the only truly competent candidate for the throne, who just has bad luck. If that were the case, my god, Stannis would be the most meh Mary Sue in all of A Song of Ice and Fire. This is why the whole it's Melisandre's fault argument, whether it comes from Davos or readers, completely undermines Stannis. Melisandre serves partly as a scapegoat in the story. By blaming everything on her, ignores Stannis' own agency. And half of Davos' character arc is about his growing disillusionment with Stannis, realizing that the man he put so much faith in is flawed and makes his own choices. Choices that he is responsible for. And most importantly, the show skewed the relationship of Stannis and Shireen by giving them one, while making Selyse the bad mother. Once again, the women around him are the issue, while Stannis is framed as the strict, cold, but ultimately loving father. In the TV series, Shireen adores him, while Selyse despises her, resenting the fact that she gave birth to a sickly daughter instead of a strong son, and dismissing her as stubborn and sinful because of the grayscale. Meanwhile, Shireen is scared of her mother's fanaticism and finds comfort in her father instead. This is the closest thing to actual fantasy we ever got from Game of Thrones. I am sorry, but in the book, Shireen barely has a relationship with Davos. They just removed all of Davos' family because who cares apparently, or Stannis. At least not one that we see, or any indication that he is a present parent. Selyse is definitely unpleasant and a fanatic follower of R'hllor, but nowhere do we see any resentment towards Shireen. Selyse blames Robert and Edric Storm, another character they removed, who was conceived on her wedding bed, for her misfortune in not having sons. Robert and Elena defiled our bed and laid a curse upon our union. This boy is the foul fruit of their fornications. Lift the shadow from my womb, and I will bear you many true-born sons, I know it. And Stannis is not exactly thrilled about it either. When he had gone to King's Landing to sit on Robert's council, he had left Selyse on Dragonstone with their daughter. His letters had been few, his visits fewer. He did his duty in the marriage bed once or twice a year, and the sons he had once hoped for had never come. He is not that great father who dreams of making Shireen a queen. He simply follows the law, and in his mind, his child is his heir. It is not a question of wanting. The throne is mine as Robert's heir. This is law. After me, it must pass to my daughter, unless Selyse should finally give me a son. Well, I do not beg, nor will I flee again. I am Robert's heir, the rightful king of Westeros. My place is with my men. Yours is in Braavos. Go with the banker and do as I have bid. As you command, Sir Justin said. It may be that we shall lose this battle, the king said grimly. In Braavos you may hear that I am dead. It may even be true. You shall find my sellswords nonetheless. The knight hesitated. Your grace, if you are dead, you will avenge my death, and sit my daughter on the Iron Throne, or die in the attempt. In the last Wainscot, he even puts vengeance and legacy at the forefront. Even in what might be his last words to Sir Justin, the priority isn't Shireen's safety or well-being, it's avenge me and put her on the throne. That's the order, that's the mindset. If anything, Shireen is way closer to her mother than to Stannis. She is comfortable enough hugging Selyse, seeking protection from her when scared. Wun began to laugh. A giant's laughter could put to shame a dragon's roar. Pat's face covered his ears. Princess Shireen pressed her face into her mother's furs. And she also sits and plays in the same room as her fairly often, and it makes sense. Stannis is her father in name, but she doesn't really know the guy all that well. It is what it is. Selyse is also far more openly protective of Shireen than Stannis ever did, and she's consistently the one reminding people that Shireen is the future ruler of Westeros. Eastwatch is not safe. The queen put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. This is the king's true heir. Shireen will one day sit the Iron Throne and rule the Seven Kingdoms. She must be kept from harm, and Eastwatch is where the attack will come. The Nightford is the place my husband has chosen for our seat, and there we should abide. Sadly, Shireen, who is mentioned only around 50 times by the way, and most of them are passing references from random people when she's not even present, is described as a lonely, sad child whose only real company is a fool with brain damage, psychological issues, and PTSD. Indeed you may, Crescent answered, as if he would ever deny her. She had been denied too often in her time. Her name was Shireen, she would be 10 of her next name day, and she was the saddest child that Maester Crescent had ever known. Her sadness is my shame, the old man thought, another mark of my failure. She only started to become more cheerful when she had lessons and played with Edric. And, by the way, it looks like Edric also considered Shireen a friend, even asked for her when he was clearly afraid and uneasy. Where are we going, Lord Davos? To the water. A ship awaits you. The boy stopped suddenly. A ship? One of Salador's sons. Sala is a good friend of mine. I shall go with you, cousin, Sir Adrian assured him. There's nothing to be frightened of. I'm not frightened. Only... Is Shireen coming too? No, said Davos. The princess must remain here with her father and mother. I have to see her then, Edric explained, to say my farewells, otherwise she'll be sad. Not so sad as if she sees you burn. There is no time, Davos said. I will tell the princess that you were thinking of her, and you can write her when you get to where you're going. Even in the prologue, Shireen is portrayed as being far closer to Crescent and Pylos than to either of her parents. And Stannis and Selyse, they're basically a mirror of each other. Lady Selyse was as tall as her husband, thin of body and thin of face, with prominent ears, a sharp nose, and the faintest hint of a moustache on her upper lip. She plucked it daily and cursed it regularly, yet it never failed to return. Her eyes were pale, her mouth stern, her voice a whip. Both tall, grim, and pleasant according to most in-universe characters, and bland, saying whatever is on their minds without caring how others will react, and neither is particularly attractive. Unlike Robert in his youth, Stannis has always looked older than he is. He grinds his teeth, he's balding, and his signature frown is so deeply ingrained that people often comment on how annoyed and unappealing he looks. The only reason Selyse's unattractiveness, as well as the fact that she is fairly sharp of tongue, and unpleasant, not happy-go-lucky, is harped on so much, is because she is a woman. And of course, a woman's greatest virtues are youth, silence, and beauty. Xernau. This is also why the obvious flaws that both Stannis and Selyse have are often projected solely on Selyse. Yes, he's entitled and unpleasant, but so is Stannis. The moment he gets angry, it's "you're just a bastard, what do you know?" or "you're just a smuggler, what do you know?" He's arrogant and condescending, many times. And honestly, if that letter Davos read from the Night's Watch hadn't conveniently allied with Melisandre's visions, do we really think Stannis would have been fine with what Davos did and said? Personally, I'm not sure. And when it comes to belief and rules, both of them follow what they think they should follow, whether it's the law, or God, or something else. Selyse fell for Melisandre's teachings for the same reasons Stannis did. Because the future Melisandre believes she can see and offers them is a future they were denied for various reasons, a future they could only dream of. And now an actual witch is here, promising to make it real, promising it is real, that she can actually see it and it is their actual future. The only difference is that Selyse truly believes in R'hllor, while Stannis doesn't care about the god himself, only the power Mel brings. Sit with me, child. Crescent beckoned her closer. This is early to calm calling. Scarce past dawn, you should be snug in your bed. I had bad dreams, Shireen told him, about the dragons. They were coming to eat me. The child had been plagued by nightmares as far back as Maester Crescent could recall. We have talked of this before, he said gently. The dragons cannot come to life. They are carved out of stone, child. He took her small pink hand in his own frail spotted one and gave it a gentle squeeze. So you see, there is nothing to fear. It looks like Shireen is far more comfortable confiding in Maester Crescent than in either of her parents. And while it's true that children in noble houses tend to be close to their maesters, since they act as teachers, doctors, and caregivers, the relationship between Stannis and Shireen isn't the same as, say, Arya and Ned's, where there's a clear sense of warmth and guidance. Shireen spends much more time with Selyse than with Stannis, who while in King's Landing didn't even bother to send letters back to Dragonstone. And I know we don't have a Stannis POV to see if they talk or have moments together, but he clearly never brings her up in other people's POVs unless it's a very matter-of-fact to-the-point way. Be that as it may, my lord, Maester Crescent said gently, great wrongs have been done to you, but the past is dust. The future may be yet be won if you join with the Starks. There are others you might sound out as well. What of Lady Arryn? If the Queen murdered her husband, surely she will want justice for him. She has a young son, Jon Arryn's heir. if you were to betroth Shireen to him. The boy is weak and sickly, Lord Stannis objected. Even his father saw how it was, when he asked me to foster him on Dragonstone. Service as a page might have done him good, but the damnable Lannister woman had Lord Arryn poisoned before it could be done. And now Lysa hides him in the Eyrie. She'll never part with the boy, I promise you that. Then you must send Shireen to the Eyrie. Dragonstone is a grim home for a child. Let her fool go with her, so she will have a familiar face about her. Familiar and hideous. Stannis frowned his brow in thought. Still, perhaps it is worth a trying. On top of that, whenever Shireen is on page, she always mentions her mother. Shireen gave a brave little nod. Mother said the White Raven means it's not summer anymore. She hardly ever mentions Stannis or anything about him. It might be sad, but Stannis' relationship with Shireen is barely there. I'm not saying he doesn't care about her. She is his child after all, but in no way, shape or form does he have the kind of relationship with her the show tried to push. And it's worth mentioning that Stannis treats his relationships with a strong sense of obligation, often with terms and conditions attached. We see this with his brothers, with Crescent, with Davos, definitely with Selyse, and even with Melisandre. So it's not far-fetched to assume that Stannis treats his relationship with his child in a similar way. He views Shireen as much, if not more, as an heir as he sees her as a daughter. And that's where they really ran into a problem. When it came time to adapt the one key detail George Martin gave them, Stannis' decision to burn Shireen, it didn't fit with how they had framed everything, pretty much. That's why, even though many fans accept that Shireen will be sacrificed in the books, they push back on the idea that it will be Stannis' decision. Instead, they say Melisandre will burn her or Selyse will burn her and Stannis won't know. But George Martin's wording was clear: Stannis' decision. The issue is that the show's version of Stannis wasn't built up to make the choice in a way that fell true not so much to his character, but mainly the rest of his magical storyline, which is why it was so jarring. Though to be fair, I partly think they just wanted it to be shocking, because plot twist. But I really think most of these changes happened because the show never cared about magic. For me, that's a big reason why the show didn't work and couldn't work in general. If they had kept Melisandre's and later Stannis' plan of waking dragons from stone, then the sacrifice would have been for that exact reason. And that would have actually made sense. A sacrifice like this would need to be something you love, which is why burning Shireen, his daughter, who is much closer to him in the show than in the books, could have worked if they had tied it to the dragon prophecy. But instead they had him sacrifice her for half the reason they burned Alastair Florent in the novels. I honestly can't think of another reason for this choice, beside them not wanting to deal with magic any more than absolutely necessary at this point. There's a reason they killed off Stannis and rushed his storyline to an end the moment he reached the north. Because, from that point on, his book arc becomes even more intertwined with magic. They had already stripped away Patchface, the other sacrifices and key magical elements, but they couldn't completely remove the others or the prophecy. Though they definitely tried. They stuck with the sword part of the prophecy until the end, while in the novels we know that Melisandre and later Stannis are far more focused on waking dragons from stone. Add to that the fact that they had already completely altered the politics in the north, and in the south for that matter. A bunch of characters with political roles were either cut entirely, or merged into weird watered-down versions. They also didn't want Rickon in the show, so they cut the Wyman-Manderly plot, which in the books is directly tied to Stannis through Davos. So what we got was a half-baked, mischaracterized version of Stannis, spectacularly played by Stephen Delane, full of loose ends, with crucial information from George Martin about his arc that couldn't be executed properly because of the choices they had already made. And this is where it happened. Iphigenia and Avlidi, but make it dumb. Shireen's burning in Game of Thrones didn't work for every reason possible, which is exactly why I truly believe will work in the books. Whether you believe Stannis is this fundamentally good, broody, no-nonsense guy who follows the law, does his duty without joy, and gets no satisfaction from victory or from being special, the prince that was promised, someone who wants to rule justly, the king who cares, who does everything for the common good and the people only, who is smart and competent, who loves his daughter more than anything in the world, or if you believe, like I do, that he's a much grayer and far more interesting character, Someone competent with a moral compass, yes, who genuinely wants to do his duty, but not just because it's the right thing to do, but partly because this duty has always been denied to him, who is also self-centered, bitter over how unfairly he's been treated, and emotionally unavailable, and treats his relationships very often as transactions, a man who might care for people in his own way, but who struggles to express it. Either way, burning Shireen is the only thing that makes sense for his character, for his storyline, and for the books in general. This is why Stannis is so compelling, this is why he doesn't have a POV, this is why people enjoy him, this is also why he wouldn't be as good of a ruler as it is often claimed. Because for every trait he has that would make him a great king, he has a flaw to counterbalance it and make him a bad one. He's always with Red Woman and he's not in his right mind, I fear. This talk of a stone dragon, madness, I tell you, sheer madness. Did we learn nothing from Aerion Brightflame, from the Nine Mages, from the Alchemists? Did we learn nothing from Summerhall? No good has ever come from these dreams of dragons. I told Axel as much. My way was better, surer. And Stannis gave me his seal. He gave me leave to rule. The hand speaks with the king's voice. Not in this. Davos was no courtier, and he did not even try to blunt his words. It is not in Stannis to yield, so long as he knows his claim is just. No more than he can unsay his words against Joffrey when he believes them true. As for the marriage, Tommen was born of the same incest as Joffrey, and his grace would sooner see Shireen dead than wed to such. A vein throbbed in Florent's forehead. He has no choice. Hasn't he? Because they are seriously discussing waking dragons instead of surrendering. Waking dragons seems very much like a choice he is weighing. He was ultimately willing to sacrifice Cedric Storm for that exact reason. On top of that, it's understood by everyone around him, Davos included, that Stannis would rather see his daughter die than surrender or compromise. Stannis explicitly states how much a dragon would have helped his cause and how it could have won them the battle at the Blackwater. Lord Husband, said Queen Selise, you have more men than Aegon did 100 years ago. All you lack are dragons. The look Stannis gave her was dark. 9 mages crossed the sea to hatch Aegon's the third caches of eggs. Baelor the Blessed prayed over his for half a year. Aegon the Fourth built dragons of wood and iron. Aerion Brightflame drank wildfire to transform himself. The mages failed. King Baelor's prayer went unanswered. The wood and dragons burned. And Prince Aerion died screaming. None of those was the chosen of R'hllor. No red comet blazed across the heavens to herald their coming. None wielded Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes. And none of them paid the price. Lady Melisandre will tell you, my lord, only death can pay for life. We could easily blame Selise here, but as the story progresses, Stannis starts to also see it as, well, damn, they were right. In this quote before, we know he was talking with Melisandre about dragons. In his fight with Davos, he is the one explaining things, clearly believing he is the Messiah and that this is something he must do. Stannis isn't just casually entertaining Melisandre's ideas, he's actively internalizing them. The story goes out of its way to show that he's not a bystander in all this. He's reaching these conclusions on his own. His fixation on prophecy, his willingness to weigh lives on scale, it all builds towards something. There is still part of the fandom that loves to argue how Stannis would never burn Shireen, but everything in the books tells us otherwise. He's the only character with direct textual parallels to every past failed dragon birth attempt, from Summerhall to Aerion Brightflame. The show tried to recreate Iphigenia at Avlis, right down to the circumstances. The weather, the need for sacrifice to appease the gods. But this just doesn't work in the context of Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire or the larger conflict of the story. It's underwhelming, illogical, and ultimately pointless. And it's not just about the massive plot holes this sacrifice creates, which I won't even get into here. The real issue is what they sacrificed Shireen for. Not to change the temperature and melt the snows for a confrontation with the others, which could have ended in tragedy, raising the stakes and reinforcing the hopelessness of the war. Not to prepare for the ultimate fight against the looming supernatural threat. No, they burned her for Ramsay Bolton. Agamemnon sacrificed Iphigenia to appease Artemis so the Greek fleet could sail to Troy, the place where the big war, the endgame, was said to take place. But in the show, they didn't sacrifice Shireen to clear the path for a confrontation with the others. They did it for the Battle of Winterfell, against Ramsay. It's not just a bad adaptation choice, it completely diminishes the weight of the act and reduces it to meaningless shock value. So while the show version of Stannis burning Shireen felt forced and out of place because they removed so many layers of his character and arc, even though it could work if they tried, in the books it's not just possible, it's inevitable. And even if we accept Stannis is this unwaveringly good father figure that loves Shireen unbelievably and does everything for the greater good to save his people, he puts their lives and well-being over his family's, over his joy, his love, he would still sacrifice what loves the most, Shireen, to do his duty as king and protector of the realm. Azor a high-tempered lightbringer with the heart's blood of his own beloved wife. If a man with 1,000 cows gives one to God, that is nothing. But a man who offers the only cow he owns. Now, if Stannis truly believes he is the prophesied Messiah, that every hardship in his life has led to this moment, that he is destined to win the eternal war, then sacrificing Shireen is again inevitable. In his mind, he isn't just another player in the game, he is the chosen one. And if destiny is not something one can refuse, which according to him you can't, then he must do what the prophecy demands. Melisandre believes it, Stannis himself by this point believes it too. They need to wake dragons from stone, and from that a sacrifice must be made. An important sacrifice to Stannis must be made. And sacrificing Shireen is Stannis sacrificing everything, because Shireen is his only daughter, his only heir, his bloodline and only legacy. And seeing how complicated Stannis is, it's a combination of both. He is entitled, but he also genuinely wants to do his duty. He is self-centered, but he still makes choices for what he believes is the greater good. That's what makes him such an interesting character. Not because his Stannis the man is the only competent king around, whose every decision is automatically the right one. Sorry, but I like the character too much to reduce him to that. Stannis' arc is one of regression, and that kind of downfall can be just as compelling, if not more, as a story of growth. And we are finally in the theory part of the video. I'm gonna throw some predictions about the battle for Winterfell, Shireen's sacrifice, as well as how Stannis' death might happen. Because yes, I don't think he will survive. In case you haven't read the released chapters from the Winds of Winter, know that there will be spoilers. Right now, Stannis and his army are in a village in the Wolfswood, west of Winterfell, preparing for the battle against the Boltons. He strikes a deal with Tycho Nestoris from the Ironbank and arranges for him to return to the wall for safety. Tycho also delivers a message from Jon Snow, warning Stannis of Arnulf Karstark's planned betrayal. Since the Maester at the Dreadfort, Hybald, admits to sending a raven to Roose Bolton with Stannis' location, Stannis arrests Arnulf, his son, and his 3 grandsons, and intends to execute them. He then orders Sir Justin Massey to escort Arya Stark, actually Jane Poole, back to Castle Black to reunite her with Jon as thank you for his advice and help. From there, Justin is to sail to Braavos and use the Ironbank's funds to hire at least 20,000 sellswords for their cause. Before sending him off, Stannis warns Justin that he may hear of his death while in Braavos, but even if that happens, he is to follow the plan regardless, avenge his death and ensure Shireen Baratheon takes the Iron Throne. Stannis is in a rough spot right now. His army is dealing with a severe food shortage, bad enough that some of his men have resorted to cannibalism. On top of that, there is a numerical disadvantage. He managed to capture Arnulf Karstark and his around 400 men, but the letter revealing their location had already been sent. What we don't know is whether Stannis suspected the Karstarks would betray him, if he had any idea what exactly they did, or how much he was prepared for it. And we also don't know if, when, or who will receive that letter. But either way, it's another major factor Stannis has to account for in his next moves. It's not something he can just ignore. It sure looks like he has something in mind. The ground, said Theon. What ground? Here? This misbegotten tower? This wretched little village? You have no high ground here, no walls to hide beyond, no natural defenses. Yet. This yet comment suggests that Stannis is at least somewhat prepared. As I mentioned at the start of this video, I'm not gonna go too deep into the battle itself. I know there are plenty of theories out there with solid arguments about how Stannis will take down the Freys, and I do think he will win. But I doubt it will be a clean victory. Right now, I think Stannis' biggest advantage is actually the northern clans. They're in their home turf, and Asa straight up says they know the woods better than anyone. They already took back Deepwood Moat and pulled off a successful ambush on the Ironborn. They're great at guerrilla warfare. Meanwhile, Stannis' own men are uneasy in the Wolfswood, completely out of their element in this weather. We're talking about a brutally unfamiliar landscape, dense, dark, freezing, with waist-high snow, and it's only getting worse. The cold is growing, the food is running out, and his southern troops are not only struggling with the conditions, but also divided by religion, making the tension in the camp even worse. So she rose to her feet, donned her own cloak, and followed him out into the blizzard. She was lost before she had gone 10 yards. Asa could see the beacon fire burning atop the watchtower, a faint orange glow floating in the air. Elsewise the village was gone. She was alone in a white world of snow and silence, blowing through snowdrifts as high as her thighs. "Justin?" she called. There was no answer. Somewhere to her left she heard a horse whicker. The poor thing sounds frightened. Perhaps he knows he's to be tomorrow's supper. Asa pulled her cloak about her tightly. She blundered back onto the village green unknowing. The pinewood stakes still stood, charred and scorched, but not burned through. The chains about the dead had cooled by now, she saw, but still held the corpses fast in their iron embrace. A raven was perched atop one, pulling at the tatters of burnt flesh that clung to its blackened skull. The blowing snow had covered the ashes at the base of the pyre, and crept up the dead man's leg as far as his ankle. The old gods meant to bury him, Asa thought. That was no work of theirs. No matter how smart, cunning, or adaptable Stannis is, and he can be, a huge chunk of his men are almost guaranteed to die. Some will fall in battle, but a lot are already dying just from the brutal conditions. Starvation, exposure, sheer exhaustion. It's inevitable. A lot of theories suggest that Stannis will use the two frozen lakes near the village to his advantage. The idea is that he'll somehow bait the Freys onto the ice, then break it beneath them, sending their troops to a freezing death. It's a solid strategy, and given Stannis' situation, he needs every advantage he can get. I know them lakes. You've been on them like maggots on a corpse, hundreds of you. Cut so many holes in the ice, it's a bloody wonder more haven't fallen through. Out by the island, there's places look like a trees the rat's been at. Lakes are done, you fish them out. I lean towards these theories myself, and honestly I think the whole Knights of the Vale saving the day thing in the show Battle of the Bastards might have been a weirdly altered version of some tidbit they had or something. Wouldn't be the first time they mashed stuff together. Call me a fool, but I do believe Stannis will take Winterfell. I also think Wyman Manderly's men, who are supposedly waiting with boats and food in the river, might not be able to sail up, but if the rivers are frozen solid enough, they could use them for faster transportation. Historically, frozen rivers were actually a way quicker out in winter than dragging supplies through deep snow and dense forests. Plus, Wyman's men are locals, which gives them the home field advantage, and the main road to Winterfell runs right alongside the river. The battle for Winterfell, I think, will mirror the Blackwater in many ways, but this time Stannis will come out on top. And that wouldn't just be a satisfying resolution, using a past failure to secure a current victory, it also works beautifully on a symbolic level. Stannis, the cold grey king who once killed his brother with a cold shadow and lost to a wildfire at Blackwater, will now win using the ice and the cold. He'll take Winterfell and return it to the Kings of Winter. It's a really cool bit of narrative symmetry that also drives home how Stannis is not Azor Ahai. I also have a feeling Davos might return with Rickon, and I can't shake the suspicion that Wyman knows about Sansa and has been in contact with a sisterman to smuggle her back north through the sisters. If you're interested in a full breakdown, I might make a video on it. I've put some key quotes on screen that makes me think this way, but I will not go too deep, because this video is already long as it is. The only reason I'm putting these Stannis speculations here is that I genuinely think this will be his high point. This will be his peak, restoring the North, getting them on his side, taking out two major allies of the current crown, and returning Winterfell to the Starks. We're in the part of the story where Stannis has, at least temporarily, set aside some of his earlier flaws. Instead of burning every bridge and fighting against the Starks and basically everyone else in Westeros, he's now fighting with and for the Starks. He's finally realizing that he needs allies. He's in contact with the Iron Bank, which is a huge deal for the legitimacy and funding of his campaign, and for once, things are actually going well. This is Stannis at his peak, The pieces are falling into place. Unlike the show, which didn't bother fleshing out this part of his story, and instead turned it into his downfall, I think this is the moment that will push him forward. This victory will make him confident enough to believe without a doubt that winning is his destiny. But it also makes him desperate enough. Confident and desperate enough to make his final mistake. To try and fulfill the Azor Ahai prophecy by waking dragons out of stone. Stannis is certain he'll have to return to the Wall. Melisandre is there, Shireen and Selyse are there, and Justin Massey is supposed to depart from Eastwatch. From what I understand, the plan is to meet either Stannis himself, or if he dies, Shireen and Selyse back at the Wall. Eastwatch by the Sea seems to be a key meeting point. And there's a chance Davos might end up there as well, considering he's supposed to find Rickon in nearby Skagos. That means Stannis will have to march back to the Wall. But with winter getting worse by the day, and food supplies running dangerously low, that march is going to be brutal. And even if they manage to get some supplies from their battles with the Boltons, they can't take everything for themselves. Stannis would have to leave food behind for the people, those already gathering in Wintertown, those in White Harbor, where most Northmen go to find shelter for the winter. Leaving them to starve isn't just immoral, it would be stupid. Alienating his new-won allies would be a disaster, he wouldn't do that. So Stannis and his men will have to face everything they've already suffered through, only now it'll be worse. And when the survivors finally make it to the Wall, they won't find stability waiting for them either. We have no way of knowing what state Jon Snow will be in by then, but what we do know is that major chaos is about to unfold there. Since another huge event is coming in the next book, one involving the others, and Stannis is possibly going to arrive after all this. Snowflakes swirled from a dark sky and ashes rose to meet them, the grey and the white whirling around each other as flaming arrows aced above a wooden wall and dead things shambled silent through the cold. Beneath a great grey cliff where fires burned inside 100 caves. Then the wind rose and the white mist came sweeping in, impossibly cold, and one by one the fires went out. Afterward only the skulls remained. Death, thought Melisandre. The skulls are death. This vision is hinted to be about the rescue mission at Hardhome. It looks like it's gonna be the biggest and first confrontation with the others. People will die. A lot of people will die. Stannis will have fewer men, tired men. Justin is said to remain in Essos until he secured the men Stannis beat him to. In a time where the Golden Company is already supporting another candidate for the throne, and many if not most major sellsword companies are in Slavers' Bay fighting either for Daenerys or for the slavers. Food will be even more difficult to find, and most importantly, how do you fight a mist? A man can fight the dead, but when their masters come, when the white mists rise up, how do you fight a mist crow? Shadows with teeth, air so cold it hurts to breathe, like a knife inside your chest. You do not know, you cannot know. Can your sword cut cold? Stannis' sword definitely cannot. The Lightbringer they have is an illusion. Once Azor Ahai fought a monster. When he thrust the sword through the belly of the beast, its blood began to boil. Smoke and steam poured from its mouth, its eyes melted, and dribbled down its cheeks, and its body burst into flame. A sword that makes its own hit. Would be a fine thing on the wall. Jon put aside his wine cup and drew on his black moleskin gloves. A pity that the sword that Stannis wields is cold. I'll be curious to see how his Lightbringer behaves in battle. Thank you for the wine. Ghost, with me. Jon Snow raised the hood of his cloak and pulled at the door. The white wolf followed him back into the night. A sword that makes its own hit is a dragon. And Melisandre constantly links the sacrifice of Nissa Nissa to both waking dragons from stone and forging Lightbringer. My lord, are you unwell? I'm frightened, Maester, he might have said. Davos was remembering a tale Salador's son had told him, of how Azor Ahai tempered Lightbringer by thrusting it through the heart of the wife he loved. He slew his wife to fight the dark. If Stannis is Azor Ahai come again, does that mean Edric Storm must play the part of Nissa Nissa? The prophecy isn't written in the common tongue. It's in High Valyrian, or whatever ancient language they speak in Asai. And when you really look at it, it doesn't seem to be about some actual magic sword at all. It's about dragons. That tracks because, one, Melisandre uses the prince that was promised interchangeably with Azor Ahai. And the Targaryens who also seem to believe in this prophecy, the one about the prince, that is actually not about an actual prince either, but a dragon, according to Maester Aemon, never gave a shit about the sword part of it. They didn't go searching for Lightbringer, they focused on dragons. We hear the story of Nissa and Lightbringer, sure, but when Melisandre actually recites the prophecy, it's about dragons. It is night in your 7 kingdoms now, the Red Woman went on, but soon the sun will rise again. The war continues, Davos Seaworth, and some will soon learn that even an ember in the ashes can still ignite a great blaze. The old maester looked at Stannis and saw only a man. You see a king. You are both wrong. He is the Lord's chosen, the warrior of fire. I have seen him leading the fight against the dark. I have seen it in the flames. The flames do not lie, else you would not be here. It is written in prophecy as well. When the red star bleeds and the darkness gathers, Azor Ahai shall be born again amidst salt and smoke to wake dragons out of stone. The bleeding star has come and gone, and Dragonstone is the place of salt and smoke. Stannis Baratheon is Azor Ahai reborn. Daenerys did wake dragons from stone, and her dragons are even described as a flaming sword above the world. One of the 3 sacrifices in that ritual was her child, her half-scaly child. The other 2 were her husband and a priestess. Daenerys, the mother of dragons, had 3 stone eggs to hatch. Stannis doesn't, but he does have something else that is stone. Shireen. Shireen is a character I really like, but she honestly makes me sad as hell. Everything about her, from her illness to her childhood, paints such a melancholic picture. Even the very first thing she says feels like an eerie foreshadowing of her fate. An ugly little girl and a sad fool, and Maester makes 3. Now there is a tale to make a man weep. Sit with me, child. This is early to come calling, scarce past dawn. You should be snug in your bed. I had bad dreams, Shireen told him, about the dragons. They were coming to eat me. Her first scene ties directly into the whole dragons waking from stone discourse, which makes sense. The A Clash of Kings prologue happens while the red comment is still visible, but I also don't think it's a coincidence that George put Shireen, Crescent and Patchface together in this prologue, because I genuinely believe these 3 are the 3 sacrifices for Stannis' cause, 3 sacrifices that will ultimately be in vain. An ugly little girl and a sad fool, and Maester makes 3. First we have Crescent, Stannis' old maester, the closest thing he ever had to a father. He sacrifices himself for Stannis in the prologue, and for what? Nothing. His death accomplishes nothing, and the way it happens is brutal. Stannis doesn't just dismiss him, he straight up humiliates him, and the saddest part is that Crescent still believes in him. The only people who seem to actually care about him in his last moments are Davos, who respects Crescent deeply and still talks and thinks of him, and strangely enough Melisandre herself, who even urges him to stop. And the cowbells pealed in his antlers, singing "Fool, fool, fool," while the Red Woman looked down on him in pity, the candle flames dancing in her red eyes. Shireen, because of her grayscale, is already partly stone, and she's not just any child with king's blood. She is the daughter of the true king, the savior king, according to Melisandre and Stannis' beliefs. The Lord of Light cherishes the innocent. There is no sacrifice more precious. From his king's blood and his untainted fire, a dragon shall be born. If there is one moment desperate enough to attempt waking dragons from stone, this is it. And if there's one person Stannis would sacrifice, it has to be Shireen. His only child, his heir, a sacrifice that actually means something to him, because otherwise it's not a sacrifice. And Shireen is tragically, perfectly written to be the story's Iphigenia. She has king's blood, she is partly stone, she is surrounded by foreshadowing, and she is the only heir Stannis has. And the most heartbreaking part is that unlike other Olor sacrifices where we've seen people push back like the Wildlings, this time no one will. They won't push back because if the visions of Hardhome are as apocalyptic as they seem, people will be desperate enough to try anything, and they already want Shireen gone. And the daughter, her face, grayscale, the Grey Death, is what we call it. It is not always mortal in children. North of the wall it is. Hemlock is a sure cure. But a pillow or a blade will work as well. If I had given birth to that poor child, I would have given her the gift of mercy long ago. This was a Val that Jon had never seen before. Princess Shireen is the queen's only child. I pity both of them, the child is not clean. If Stannis wins the war, Shireen will stand as heir to the Iron Throne. Then I pity your 7 kingdoms. The Maesters say grayscale is not The maesters may believe what they wish. Ask a good witch, if you could know the truth. The great death sleeps only to wake again. The child is not clean. She seems a sweet girl. You cannot know. I can. You know nothing, Jon Snow. I want the master out of there. Him and his wet nurses. You cannot leave them in the same tower as the dead girl. She is not dead. She is. Her mother cannot see it, nor you, it seems, yet death is here. Val immediately sees Shireen as a walking death sentence. She believes grayscale never truly goes away, it sleeps only to wake again. And judging by the way she talks about it, it might be partly magical as well. Sadly, from the moment we meet Shireen, her death is inevitable. The pattern is already set. Crescent died, Shireen will die, and so will Spatsface. That creature is dangerous. Many a time I have glimpsed him in my flames. Sometimes there are skulls about him, and his lips are red with blood. Spatsface isn't dangerous, not in the way Melisandre thinks. Every time she sees skulls, it's a death omen. She's not seeing Spatsface killing, she's seeing Spatsface dying. If they try to sacrifice Shireen, and they will, Spatsface won't stay quiet. He loves Shireen. Either he'll jump in to save her, or he'll cause enough of a scene that they'll kill him alongside her. This is something I never seen people talk about, but Spatsface is probably the closest thing Stannis ever had to a childhood friend. Think about it, Spatsface most likely played the same role for Stannis that he does for Shireen now. He came to Storm's End as a kid, around Stannis' age, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, we don't know for sure, but he was close enough in age to Stannis that they would have grown up together. And there's this line from the letter Stefan Baratheon sent home before he died. Perhaps in time he will even teach Stannis how to laugh. It saddened Crescent to remember that letter. No one had ever taught Stannis how to laugh, least of all the boy Spatsface. Crescent was the one who saved Spatsface from death, and from everything we've seen, he was willing to care for him too afterwards. Spatsface and Stannis likely did spend time together as children, even if that's rarely acknowledged. Spatsface went with Stannis at Dragonstone, he survived the siege before that, and Stannis is completely fine with him spending all his time with Shireen. He trusts him enough with that. That makes this even more tragic. And then there's Selyse. Selyse's death is again, I think, inevitable. But unlike Shireen, she'll probably go willingly. Selyse is fanatical enough that sacrificing herself would make sense. We already see how deep her devotion runs. He glanced at Queen Selyse. There must have been a blizzard the day she and Stannis wed. Huddled beneath her ermine mantle and surrounded by her ladies serving girls and knights, the Southern Queen seemed a frail, pale-shrinking thing. A strange smile was frozen into place on her thin lips, but her eyes brimmed with reverence. She hates the cold but loves the flames. He had only to look at her to see that. A word from Melisandre, and she would walk into the fire willingly, embrace it like a lover. She'll gladly throw herself into the fire if she believes it will bring victory. And in the end, like Crescent, like Shireen, and like Spatsface, it will all be for nothing. This sacrifice will be Stannis' Waterloo. Not only has he himself admitted right before finally deciding that yes, they had to sacrifice Edric to wake dragons from stone, that the Targaryens who attempted it before were fools, which is ironic, but it's also been made clear that every similar attempt has ended in tragedy. 9 mages crossed the sea to hatch Aegon III's cache of eggs. Baelor the Blessed prayed over his for half a year. Aegon IV built dragons of wood and iron. Aeron Bright Flame drank wildfire to transform himself. The mages failed. King Baelor's prayers went unanswered. The wooden dragons burned, and Prince Aerion died screaming. And this will be no different. A sacrifice involving magic to wake dragons is guaranteed to go horribly wrong. Probably in a way that kills even those around them. I wouldn't be surprised if Stannis himself ends up dying in the bonfire, either because things spiral out of control, Summerhall style, or because he walks into the flames himself. It wouldn't be that crazy actually, we've seen this pattern before, characters having visions of dragons, believing they'll be reborn through fire only to die. Aerion drank wildfire thinking he'd transform into a dragon, Aerys believed that when he burned he rise again as one, and of course Daenerys did walk into the pyre. I think Stannis' end will come with this sacrifice, and I think it will be ironically climactic in its anticlimax, if that makes sense. Stannis is such a complex character. It's rare to have someone who is at once so selfish, proud, bitter, and self-righteous, yet also lawful, dutiful, just, and full of potential, and somehow you still find yourself rooting for him. Personally, I would love for his end to be him walking into the pyre himself and just dying. Because this would keep his characterization intact. If anything, it would complete it. He remains selfless in his selfishness. He's not just sacrificing others to fulfill his supposed destiny and save the day, he's willing to sacrifice himself, if that's what it takes. It will be tragic, it will be for nothing, but it will also be a fitting end for Stannis. It will also be a very powerful end for him and his people, minus Davos, the one man who always supported the cause but never abandoned his values, and Melisandre, who would be left shattered, watching as her god abandons her. That to me feels like the more fitting and poetic conclusion to their arcs. I can imagine a version where he survives the sacrifice only to realize, oh fuck, I'm not Azor Ahai, but that would feel underwhelming because I cannot imagine Stannis would stop trying if he remained alive after the sacrifice. Realizing in the moment of this failure that it was all in vain, that would be the tragic culmination of his arc. Not a grand victory, not the fulfillment of the prophecy he clung to, but the harsh, unrelenting truth that he was never more than a man. I'd probably love that kind of conclusion if Stannis had a POV. But he doesn't. And since Melisandre, the one who believes in him the most, believes him to be more than a man even, does have a POV, I actually find this end more fitting. Stannis surviving this long only to lose all belief in his destiny would in a sense be the true death of Stannis Baratheon, but because we can't get inside his head, it might not land as hard. It might just feel vague. I can absolutely see that being the ending, and it could work, but I'm not sure I'd like it. This is Stannis Baratheon. The man will fight to the bitter end, and then some.